you miss me? I've been out of it comatose, but the depression is over.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the weekly hobby list podcast from me, SlowBurne from Wildfire Gaming. My brother and I have been watching through Game of Thrones for him for the first time, me for my third. And I've also been reading through the books with my wife, who is also here in the podcast. Reagan, thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're currently on the third book, A Storm of Swords. So I think this is a good time to do something that we had discussed doing for some time, which was discussing the series on the podcast, and really kind of delving into looks at the best characters, the best moments, the best episodes of the show, and some of the best chapters as well. So I want to discuss changes between the two mediums as best we can. Eventually, we're going to get to the point where I obviously run out of books, but even before that, we're not going to be able to keep up with the books, so we'll have to go back and do those later. But for the first two seasons, we'll be able to do them side by side at the same time. And we're going to be doing season one today. And it's going to be really interesting to take a look at that because the changes really are mostly negligible for season one, I think, but they should multiply significantly according to what I've heard as the series goes on. So I know that the series as a whole is a huge discussing point online, even for Day, mostly because all of the stuff that Reagan watches, this is pretty much everything that she does, other than she's not playing Disney Dreamlight Valley. So if you want to write in to discuss our findings, opinions, and theories from the series, you can write into the podcast at controlledburnes with an ES at gmail.com.
I do spend a lot of time watching theory videos online. I binge the show to finish right in time for the finale when it came out in 2019. And then I read all the books during quarantine in 2020 and became a pretty big fan. The books did raise the bar for me in a way that diminished my enjoyment of the show a little bit. Obviously, the books are unfinished, so that's a point against them. But I am one of the few optimists that thinks there's a chance, and we're definitely going to get the next one. Um, I do watch a lot of theory videos on YouTube and have some theories of my own that I can't discuss yet because Andrew is not caught up in the books. But I'm very excited as we approach things that he doesn't know will happen and new characters in the books that aren't in later seasons of Game of Thrones. Very excited to see his reaction. So this will be the first in a series of podcasts on the topic.
Well, generally, I think we're going to do one season for our first 8 discussions, one season per podcast. Because we'll definitely be done by the time we catch up because we are on with Brandon, we are on almost the end of season 5 right now on the show. And we usually watch 5 or 6 episodes a week with him because he comes over on Monday nights and then we just watch until he has to leave in the wee hours of the morning. For me, I was aware of the show obviously whenever it was coming out, but I thought it looked cool, but didn't watch it, didn't have HBO or anything. And I never was interested enough, I guess, to go through with all that. And so I started it on me and Reagan's first date.
That's right.
And then we watched the whole show together. And then
Spoiler warning, it was very romantic ending the night watching Lady's demise, the most painful death in all of Game of Thrones.
Okay. And then I watched it again pretty quickly after that. We were still living in Rockwall when we watched it with Brett, my cousin Brett, who's been on the show to talk about his NFL predictions.
I was there for most of that. I don't think I caught every episode with Brett.
Okay. Yeah, definitely not. And then, so it's been a couple years since then. That was probably 2021, maybe into 2022, but mostly 2021 when we watched those with Brett. So really, I watched it kind of 2 times that year, I guess. And then yeah, so it's been obviously it's been some time since then, and I dreamed of watching it with Brandon. I really wanted to see his reaction to some things in particular, but I didn't think we would actually do it. But somehow we actually did convince him to come over and start watching them, and I think he's pretty into it.
I'm going to take credit for that one. I think it was a Christmas miracle, but I bought Andrew a Game of Thrones board game for
Yes.
Christmas, and there are spoilers for season 1 in it, and you need a certain number of players. And so we were like, we need you, Brandon. And also, you have to watch the show first.
If that's true, I don't think he remembers that. I doubt that he's even thinking about playing that board game.
Well, that's the next hurdle, but that was the turning point.
But not for me. For me, the next hurdle is getting him to play the Mass Effect games with us.
Sure. Oh, and we also have played the Game of Thrones Telltale game.
Oh yeah, which is not very important or significant at all.
No, but it does have some interesting parallels to the books that I'd like to talk about when we
Really.
get to a Dance with Dragons.
Well, then we might have to play it again because
The
it's pretty rusty.
A
on
Dance with
that.
Dragons.
Okay, well, for what I want to do, I definitely have some lists that they're just kind of ranking some aspects of season 1 and book 1, but mostly it is going to hew, I think, a little bit more to the show in terms of the ranking portion. But to start, I thought it would be interesting to really look at a synopsis of each episode through the lens of what was happening in the book over that course of time. And so I went through every episode of season 1 and my notes because I do take notes whenever we read the books, of kind of like what happened in the chapters.
As well as every character.
Right, but
that
I'm not
pops
dealing
up
with
in
that.
the
Right now I'm just talking about the chapters, the summaries. And I went through and it was like kind of like, okay, this is season 1. These chapters took place there, and I went through and I was gonna uh, look at the changes that were made. I didn't expect there to be that many changes, but there were actually some more changes than I expected, and definitely some additions to the show, as well as some things that were taken out. So I think that's going to be kind of interesting to look at. So obviously, we'll start with episode 101. That's kind of how they do it in the biz these days, with different seasons. And that episode is called Winter's Coming. So that basically takes us through from the introductory chapter of the book through, which is not chapter 1, through chapter 8. So really 9 chapters. My synopsis here that I'm going to be reading is going to be mostly from the book, and then I'm going to make a note. We'll discuss the changes that are made kind of as they come up.
Okay.
So to start off with the book, it's Will, Garrett, and Waymar Royce are the 3 guys that are in the Night's Watch that are tracking wildlings north of the wall, and they come up upon some. Now, in the book, Royce is killed in battle, and Will is killed shortly thereafter by Royce, who was a White Walker by then, or whatever, a White by then.
Yes.
And then it kind of cuts dramatically from that to the next sequence where they introduce all of the characters at what are.
And Will is the point of view in that prologue. Are we doing spoilers for past book 1 or only in season 1 or only up to?
Well,
What can I say?
It's not really necessary to spoil anything in the future. I think we could just talk about book 1.
Okay.
But yeah, so anyway, we are introduced to the Starks basically. Bran, John, and Robb watches Ned kills Garrett for deserting the Night's Watch in the book. And then they get their direwolf puppies, which is what happens in both. The show, what are the differences there? Basically, the big difference there is in the show, it's the younger guy that survives the White Walkers, whereas in the book, it's the older guy, which I think they did that just to basically say, hey, we can change stuff. But
Oh, interesting.
I do think it is, and just to subvert expectations, I guess, for people who have read it. But it's like not a very big change in the grand scheme of things. But I do think it is stronger to have the more grizzled guy be the deserter, as it is in the book.
Yes, it creates more of a feeling of dread and makes the Whites a bigger threat if the seasoned veteran of the Night's Watch is the one to desert and not kind of the new pompous one. And he has his great moment going down, where he's kind of an asshole the whole chapter, but then at the end, he's the one that stands and fights till the end, in kind of an inspiring way. It's an interesting nuance. And I think the 3 different kind of archetypes that you find within the within the Night's Watch are represented in that prologue with kind of the older seasoned veteran, the one that has a little bit more privilege, comes in from maybe a minor house with a little bit more money and so has like nicer equipment just because you can take whatever you bring. And then someone that was kind of forced to come because it's either that or execution because of crimes or something.
Well, it really just, I think, just legitimizes them, or it makes it seem like like you said, kind of like a bigger threat, but just because it wasn't just some young pup that was running away, like it kind of is in the show. I mean, they try to legitimize him, like when Ned's brother comes in later on, he's like, yeah, he was a hard ranger, he wasn't like a coward or whatever. But we don't really see that. Whereas in the book, it's like this old guy who's been there for a lot longer. So it's just an interesting change. I think one that was not really necessary, but
I think
not a huge deal.
I think it also has implications on Ned's decision to execute the traitor a little later on, because if he's not listening to or taking seriously the younger one, that's one thing. But the Night's Watch is a very respected organization, and this, um, seasoned ranger that he's executing and not listening to, um, it says a little bit more about Ned's denial and him being stuck in his ways and traditions. And obviously, it would be a lot better for Westeros if he had listened to him. But that kind of silences the threat of the whites for a long time in the series until Jon Snow is able to rally some troops.
Well, that was a spoiler, but
I'm sorry.
moving on to
You
the
can cut
show.
that.
The show adds this scene that's not in the book where they kind of introduce Jamie and Cersei early. They're kind of watching over as they are kind of at the. I don't know if it's really the wake or whatever because they're like the only ones that are there, but they're kind of preparing, I guess, the body for Jon Arryn. And they're obviously talking pretty slyly, like you don't really get a whole lot out of it other than it's kind of clear these are not the most honorable duo in the show compared to the Starks that we've seen so far. But you don't learn too much about them. But obviously they didn't have that in the book because neither of those are point of view characters, so that was something that they added. Then we go back to the book where Catelyn, tells Ned that Jon Arryn is dead. They get word, and that Robert Baratheon is coming to Winterfell. So that's all the same. Daenerys is taken by Magister Illyrio of Viserys to be wed to Khal Drogo. That's a whole chapter in the book. Then King Robert arrives in Winterfell, and he and Ned pay their respects to Lyanna. All that's exactly the same. And then Robert asks Ned to be the hand of the king. What is different while all this is going on is the way the show introduces Tyrion
Oh
with
boy.
that questionable scene where he's in the brothel with Roz. Already, um, I've never really been a big fan of Roz as a character, which is she's a show exclusive
Yes.
character, and I think an unnecessary one. But she's here. And Tyrion is there in the brothel. And it's weirdly cut in between. So in the book, it's all one shot or one sequence where Ned and Robert go down to the crypts to visit Lyanna, and he offers them the job and everything, and it's like very somber. But they weirdly intersperse that in the show with this clip of introducing Tyrion in the brothel.
It's definitely a little jarring
Hmm.
with the pacing there and a little hard to take seriously. And just another example of the show
The
not trusting the
first.
viewers. Okay, sure. Yeah, the first example of the show not trusting the viewers to be interested without uh, sex and violence.
Yes. Well, I think they do a better job of cutting back on that stuff past season one, but we're gonna have some pretty interest. Like I think it is they stand out as being more egregious when you're looking at the context of the book because they're just like a lot of those scenes are just not in the book at all, and don't really add anything to the show and kind of seem like a bit of a waste of time. But the show also adds a scene here, which is a scene where Catelyn is basically just fixing up Sansa's hair, just like an interaction between those two that is not in the book. And already at this point, you can tell that they've changed Sansa's character from the book because she's like extremely whiny. She's very insufferable about how being the queen is all she's ever wanted, and please make dad say yes to the betrothal idea, I guess, with her and Joffrey, and it's just it just kind of like this entitlement about her that is in that scene that kind of gives you an indication of where they're going with that character, as opposed to kind of how she is in the book, where she is, I think, supposed to be kind of pampered and whatnot in the book, but she has like this meanness in the show that is not really there in the book, I think.
I agree. I think that in the book, she very clearly has a good heart and she's very naive and she um, believes in the role of women in her society and has leaned hard into that, um, and has listened to these songs all her life and has this idealized version of what court will be like and what her role within that will be. And I really don't think that the showrunners understood her character because I can't imagine that they would have actively chosen to make her worse in the show. And this will not be the low point of Sansa's character. But certainly she's someone that you in both mediums grow to like more as she grows as a character.
Well, that's definitely what you're supposed to do. I don't know if they accomplish that in the show as it goes on, but I was a big surprising thing for me. I think she was definitely the biggest, I guess, surprise for me in reading the first book, and that how interested she doesn't have very many chapters, and I was interested in her chapters, more interested than I thought it would be. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later on.
Yes, they're some of my favorites.
So the
Sorry, one more thing. We should mention how all the kids were aged up in the show
Oh,
significantly.
okay.
I think Bran is 8 or 9, Rickon's 4 in the books, Sansa is 11. Uh, maybe Arya's, I'm getting it mixed up now, but they aged him up 4 or 5 years, depending, including Dany, which has major implications in her plot line with Khal Drogo, let's say.
Hmm.
I understand why they made that choice. It's really hard to work with child actors, and when they're cast younger, you have a harder time knowing how talented they'll be. Um, but it definitely changes a lot. And as these characters make mistakes that may be more understandable if they were 4 or 5 years younger, it kind of can make them look a little stupider than they need to.
Well, maybe, but I honestly, I think that's a good change. I think it's more interesting if they're older teenagers, or like the main characters are older teenagers, or even like become more like adults than kids. I don't know. It's harder for me to get invested in a story about a bunch of children, I think. And so I'd prefer the changes that they made in the show ultimately on that, I think. The next few scenes are the same. John tells Benjen he wants to join the Night's Watch. Benjen isn't so sure. And then John makes kind of a fuss as he exits, and then he meets Tyrion outside, and they kind of begin to bond. But in the books, we don't actually get any shots inside the feast itself. Whereas obviously in the show we do. We see some scenes of Robert looking like an ass. Ned has kind of like this hostile interaction with Jamie. And he also reunites with Benjen, we see. Sansa meets with Cersei, which is, a pretty important moment. None of this is in the book. So I think that was probably a good idea to flesh out some of those interactions more in the show.
They also cut Peter Dinklage doing a cartwheel as Tyrion, or a little somersault, which might have looked a little silly, but definitely was an early indication that they wanted this to be a lot more grounded and lean away from some of the more fantastical elements.
And then Catelyn and Ned receive a letter from Lysa saying, which is her sister, saying Jon Arryn was murdered by Cersei Lannister. And this is a great scene in both the book and the show. But what I think is the biggest difference here is Ned does not want to do this, which he doesn't want to do that in the show either. But Catelyn is actually saying that he should.
Yes.
In the book. Whereas in the show, she's very much against this idea, and it's the Maester that is telling him that he should do it. So that's an interesting change. I think it's like later on, after some events at the end of the first episode where Catelyn kind of changes her tune on that, and so maybe they just wanted to make her a little bit more consistent in the show. But that was surprised by that reading in the book that she actually was saying that he should go.
Yes, they definitely. I feel like Catelyn is one where there are points where she is fleshed out a little bit better in the show, but overall, definitely, I feel like book Catelyn wasn't fully done justice in a lot of her nuances.
Okay. Well, it regardless, obviously Ned does agree to do it, and then he agrees that Jon can go to the Night's Watch. Robb and Rickon are going to stay in Winterfell with Catelyn, is the plan, and then the remaining children are to come with him to King's Landing. So that's all pretty much the same. There's a scene where we're kind of introduced to Arya not being very good at sewing, which is not surprising, but it's kind of an interaction that they set up with Sansa and Arya. And this is kind of in the show where she is sewing at one point, but Sansa isn't really mean to her about her shittiness at sewing. So it's just kind of interesting, again, kind of the changes that they made to her character. I think she is better in the book, definitively.
I think in the books, Arya is a lot harder on herself about not being able to live up to the standard that her sister sets in living up to this role that the society puts on these young ladies. Whereas you can't get into Arya's inner monologue in the show, and so they put all of that into Sansa's mouth, which hurts Sansa's character.
Agreed. Yeah, that's definitely a mistake. I understand you can't really get into the psyche with characters as well in the show as you can in the books, but I think it would have been better if they. I think that it makes sense. They do need to have kind of a strained relationship, but I don't think it needs to be a hostile relationship. I think that's a mistake that they made, and they kind of try to pay that off like way down the line in later seasons. But I think people think that falls flat too. But I think that is a clear strength of the book over the show. So that's interesting to point out. Then another thing that happens here in this Arya chapter is she gets this whole sequence that they completely cut from the show, I guess to make time for Tyrion to have sex with Ross, where she joins Jon. They're like kind of on an overlook, and they're looking down, and Bran is actually training with Tommen, of all people. And then Robb gets like into this like quarrel with Joffrey, that's kind of cool in that it's kind of like moves up your inclination that Joffrey is kind of no good. But more interesting, I think, is this idea that Bran is training with Tommen, given what happens later on.
And they're both bundled up in padding, and Joffrey is being mean, not just about Bran, but also about Tommen, which is a dynamic we never really get to see in the show that I remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, we have nothing with Tommen until way later in the show. He just kind of comes out of nowhere as a character. Whereas here, that it's not like a big scene. They're obviously not really. They're just looking at him from a distance. But the idea that he's kind of an introduced character, I think, is better because it sets him up because he does become much more significant later. But really what they did instead of having this scene, because the scene with Tyrion really isn't that long, but they actually skip ahead, and this is a common theme I found in the show is I think maybe there wasn't quite enough with Daenerys in the book to stretch across an entire season of the show. And more so I think that there's longer gaps between her stuff in the book. And so they move some things up so that you get some Daenerys stuff each episode. And so the thing that they move up here, like if we were going strictly based on the book, we would be done with her for this episode. Like we have that one thing where the one chapter where introduces that she's supposed to wed Khal Drogo, and he comes and looks at her or whatever, but we don't like do anything else. Whereas with here we go all the way through, we get the wedding scene, which introduces Jorah Mormont. She gets the dragon eggs here in the show, that's all moved forward, and then even like past that where she gets the horse, and then she goes off and gets raped by Khal Drogo. And then
that couldn't wait to get to that.
I had to get that in episode 1, and then that scene itself is also very different because in the book she's actually into it, whereas in the show it's like
she's terrified.
Episodes later.
In the books, first off, it's statutory rape. She's cannot consent. She's too young.
By U.S. law, yes, but and it's just in the show, it's a rape no matter what. If she could have been 40 and it would have been a rape in the show. Whereas in the book, they do it very differently where, I was very surprised by that.
Well, so in the book, she is terrified. She doesn't want to go. She says no many times but he doesn't
Yeah, they still have
push
the
her all
note.
the way until she says yes at the very end of the chapter. And then you cut away. You don't actually have to see
Right.
that scene, which is something that the show is not very good at doing.
No, definitely not. That would have been better, probably. Well, I mean, like in the show, there's like another scene where she's being raped by Drogo in the show. Like they give you more of it than there is in the book. But
Mhm.
that's in later episodes, so we'll talk about that. And then, of course, the culmination of this episode is the same either way, which is we have Bran climbing around on Winterfell, and he comes upon Cersei and Jaime having some sex, and Jaime pushes him out the window. So that's kind of the cliffhanger ending for episode 1. Go to episode 2, which is called The King's Road. This is covering chapters 9 through 16. It's interesting to see the differences between how much ground is covered in each one so far as well. So like the first one, it's like 9 chapters. This one is like whatever. What it's 9 to 16? Is that 8 chapters? So similar amount. But there's going to be much bigger discrepancies later. So pretty much as in the show, Tyrion wakes up. Although in the show he has been like reading all night, or in the book rather, he's been reading all night. In the show he wakes up in like with some dogs or something. So they're kind of making him more of a joke in the show than kind of the astute side of Tyrion.
Yes.
But
They talk a lot about how much he reads, but you don't see it much in the show.
yeah, but the interaction that he has with Joffrey is pretty much word for word, line for line. He slaps him for not offering the Starks his sympathies, and then he goes and has breakfast with the siblings, Tom and Marcella. Then the show adds this scene, which is very good. Like the show does this some things very well, where they add these scenes. It's just a huge discrepancy between the scenes they add because some of them are completely pointless and some of them are excellent. And I think the first scene that they add here that is like really really great is the scene where Cersei visits Catelyn at Bran's bedside and kind of it's sort of two-faced in the sense that she's the reason that he's on the bedside, but like she like offers his condolences and gets kind of deep about her backstory where she had a son that died and kind of how she sort of had a crisis of faith at that, and like all of this stuff is a really good psychologically rich scene that is just not in the books at all. That I think is kind of the beginning of the show's probably better handling of Cersei overall, but part of that is just because she's not a point of view character, so she probably doesn't get as many opportunities to be fleshed out in the book compared to the show. So
Well, and I will say it is a pivot in her character from the books where she does everything she can to not have a living child by Robert. I don't think that she would have grieved that baby in the same way as Show Cersei. I think Show Cersei has a lot more compassion and depth. And while Book Cersei is a fun villain, I do think that Show Cersei might be one that I prefer.
Okay, I agree.
Until the
So
end,
far.
where she fizzles out. But
Well, we can't compare that to the books because they do not exist.
sure.
The next sequence is the same, where it's just basically Jon saying goodbye to Bran and Robb and Arya, and he gives her needle. All that's very good. Then the companies part ways, and there's really, I don't think in the book there is not the scene where Ned tells Jon next time they meet he'll tell him about his mother.
No.
So that's a cool scene. Another good scene I think that they added in the show. This is where in the book we have the wedding to Khal Drogo, so obviously that is just not here in the show. Then we get the scene where it's Ned and Robert riding together on the King's Road, which I think is an amazing sequence in the show and the book. But it's a little bit different in the book because they just get a little bit more technical here. Like Robert admits that he has named Jaime Lannister the new Warden of the East following Jon Arryn's death. That's not really anything they bother with in the show. And we already have Ned like saying, he's no good to Robert, but Robert's just kind of not really paying attention to what he's saying. And so that is a little bit different, but we'll go into, I think, when we're ranking my favorite moments, the sequence in the show. But I really like that sequence a lot, where they're just kind of talking about everything that's going on and some of their histories together.
Yes.
Then because we already moved up Daenerys's wedding instead, what we get here is just another rape scene, just for fun, with no additional context or like dialogue or anything whatsoever. So it's just a completely unnecessary scene that they added for funsies.
Won't be the last time.
Yeah. Then we have Tyrion, and Jon Snow and their company kind of making their way to the wall. And Tyrion and Jon are continuing to bond here. Although in the book they added this, or well, I guess in the show they cut this sequence where Ghost almost kills him because he's like very protective of Jon Snow, and he can tell that Snow's getting a little agitated during their conversation at one point. Jon calls him off. But
Yes.
they definitely limited the presence of the direwolves on the show, which is a shame.
It's a tragedy, really.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll blame budgetary constraints. It's a dire wolves, but at this point, they're puppies. There's dogs
Yeah.
that size.
I mean, it kind of makes sense for the first season maybe, but after it was like such a gigantic hit, I think they could have mixed them in more for sure.
Absolutely.
But
the dire wolves play a much bigger role in the books, and it's add a lot of the heart that is missing in the show.
But then in the book and the show, we have the attempt on Bran's life where Catelyn, but mostly Summer, save him. And
Summer.
And then that's like a Catelyn chapter. So then we actually get her like waking up. And like in the book, or in the movie, the show, they kind of speed it up. Like she kind of has this investigation where she goes up and finds a strand of hair in that tower, and she kind of gathers her retinue there, and she's like, "I'm gonna go to King's Landing and learn more about what's going on here because I think there's some foul play going on."
Which makes Catelyn look more intelligent and have more agency, and it's also interesting how she does her complete 180 on the direwolves because she despises them before Summer saves Bran. And then she is completely like, oh, they need to be with the kids at all times. They were sent by the gods to protect them.
Yeah, that's another kind of piece of psychology that's not really in the show at all. But okay, here's completely new scenes, I believe, and it's of course Daenerys again. We have Daenerys asking her handmaiden to teach her how to please the call. And this is followed up by an unnecessary scene of her playing sex with the handmaiden. And then she has sex with Drogo again. And she flips it around on him, I guess, if you want to call it that. So that's like, that eats up a significant amount of time in this episode. And all of that is just not in the book at all. Which I think that is something that if they make, because obviously it doesn't take long. Here it is, episode 2, and they've already gotten to basically where they are during their first interaction at the end of her chapter with the wedding. So it's really just kind of a waste of time for like I think the book did it better where it's just like yeah she's not into it at first and then she's into it and we kind of move on from there. Whereas like in the show they drag it out and we get all these extra sex scenes over it. And it's just like that's time that we could have they could have just been shorter, tighter episodes if we didn't need to add anything. Or we could have gotten a little bit more with maybe the psychology with Catelyn and the direwolves, or we could have had that scene with Tommen in the first episode. These are just things that I think the book is a little bit everything in the book seems necessary, right? Obviously, because this is from the creator himself, directly from his brain, and so there's nothing in there that could be construed as padding because this is all building to what he has set out. Whereas like in the show, when you do them side by side like this, it didn't stand out to me whenever I was just watching the show the first time. But whenever you really line them up, it really sticks out these unnecessary scenes that are kind of thrown in for shock value or sex value or whatever, which was definitely more of a thing I will say in 2011. I think that's just kind of more of a reality of where television was at that time because that's when they had like all those vampire shows and stuff.
Sure. But I also think Game of Thrones kicked that into high gear with its I think people
contributed to it for sure.
Well, one of two things. Either creators misunderstood what made it so popular and what made it so good, and thought that it was the shock value and sex and violence. Or that is what most people got out of it, and they missed a lot of the more nuanced value that the series contains.
Yeah, maybe, but the thing is they cut a lot of that as you go through the series, and the series only got more popular. So I don't really think that's what most people were watching it for. And at the same time, this is 2011, so we are over halfway through Breaking Bad at this point, which doesn't
Sure.
have like any of that really. I mean, there's like a couple things here and there, but and that was a universally beloved show that was also very successful. So, Game of Thrones was a bigger success, so maybe you can contribute some of that to this, but I don't think so. I think it would have been just as successful without it. I think it's just maybe some of the executives didn't think it would have been.
Sure.
So we have Sansa kind of has this date with Joffrey. They're kind of walking around in the woods, and then they come upon Arya and Micah playing with sticks. Joffrey makes some trouble, and then he gets his arm torn up by Nymeria for the first trouble. All that's the same.
Well, in the books, Sansa's terribly drunk for this. Joffrey
Oh, really?
pressured her into drinking for more than one glass for the first time.
Well, that's kind of in the show, but she
You
doesn't
can't really
she
tell
doesn't
that
act
she's
drunk.
yeah.
Okay. The show does add the scene of Arya throwing rocks at Nymeria to get her to run away. They do acknowledge that this happened in the book, but you're not like from Arya's perspective while that's going on.
Well, and it's not Arya's idea. She doesn't do it alone.
Hmm.
One of Ned's men comes and finds her and does it because he's, a grown man that can think it through, and she's a scared child.
Yeah. So then we have the quote unquote trial of Arya. And then that kind of ends with they can't find Nymeria because she's run away, and they can't really punish Arya because she's just a little girl. So it ends with them having to kill Lady.
I would like to say that it's not that she's a little girl, it's that she's a little highborn girl.
Right.
It's not the child part that gets punishing.
She's the daughter of the hand.
As you see at the end of the episode.
Right. And then of course Micah is killed. But that's just kind of, we don't see that. He's killed by the hand. We don't see it happen in either one, but or by the hound rather. But we do see like him kind of wheeling him up, and Ned kind of comes across him, and is kind of horrified by that. But that's like basically just Joffrey commanded that to happen, and so the hound did it.
Sure. I think it's so brilliant how it's done because you get so caught up in the fate of the girls and then the dire wolves, and you're so torn up about Lady, and you completely forget about this other little boy. And in the books, when he comes, he's covered in a tarp or blanket or something, and Ned has just killed Lady, and he thinks that it's Nymeria, and his heart sinks, and he's like, "Oh my God, now both the direwolves are killed." And then it's revealed that it's Micah, the butcher's boy, and you're like, "Oh shit."
Mm-hmm.
That's
in both contexts it works as an oh shit moment for Ned for sure. Like you can see it in his face in the show, and you can kind of see it in his thoughts in the book. The only other difference here is just they always try to, and I think they do it better in some episodes than others, and there's kind of some weak ones I would say in episode 1, and they kind of try to end on a cliffhanger every time for every episode, and so the cliffhanger quote unquote ending for this one is Bran wakes up as Lady dies, which is not connected in any way, but they just gave you that to ruminate on for the next week, I guess.
Sure.
When it came out. So then we move on to episode 3, which is called Lord Snow. This covers chapters 17 through 23. And both start with Bran. He's having his first three-eyed raven dream of many. So he's like learning to fly, and he looks across the realm, and he's kind of, in the book, he's sort of gaining insight into what is happening across the realm. But then he wakes up, and actually there's this scene where he names the wolf Summer here. So Summer doesn't actually have a name in the book until this point.
Yes.
So they kind of, the dream is there, but they move along it pretty fast, which I appreciate. Then there is, like I said, like pretty much completely removed. Then we get a scene in the show instead where it's Bran and old Nan, and she's like kind of telling him the story about the long night, essentially. Like, where, I don't know if it's like a prophecy or she's like saying this happened in ancient times or something, but it's essentially she's talking about the end of the show.
Well, the long night has happened before.
Okay.
She's talking about the first long night.
Sure. So that's what we get instead. Then we get Catelyn traveling to King's Landing with Roderick. She gets there ahead of Ned in the book, so this is a change. I'm going to talk about all that in a minute. But so she meets with Littlefinger and Varys. This is where Littlefinger tells her that the dagger was his, but that it had been won off him by Tyrion Lannister. So this happens completely out of order with the show, because in the show Ned arrives first, which definitely makes more sense in the sense that he left a lot earlier. But the idea in the book is that because it's not a large party, it's just Catelyn and Roderick, they can move quicker.
Yes, a whole like King's Party is hundreds of people, and that's gonna take a lot longer to get down the King's Road than a couple of riders.
Yeah, so ultimately it's the same story. It's just it happens in a different order. Then we have Jon Snow training to become a brother of the Night's Watch. He learns that Bran is going to live, and then he makes an enemy of Alistair Thorne as he kind of makes friends with Grin and the other brothers that are in training with him. Ned arrives in King's Landing, and he has his first small council meeting, which is considering the price of the tournament of his appointment for his in celebration of his appointment.
Excellent scene.
Yeah, and then they do flesh it out a little bit in the show because they add a scene where he walks in. It's like kind of mirroring what happened in the past, where he walks in and he's not sitting on the throne this time, but he's like sitting on the steps, and they kind of have another little scene where they are sort of throwing jabs at each other.
Yes.
Which is very good. I like all that. Afterward, Littlefinger takes him to Catelyn in the brothel, and they discuss what she has quote unquote learned about quote unquote Tyrion's dagger.
Yes.
And then Ned kind of convinces her to return to Winterfell.
Which that's kind of a whole mess that in the books, Andrew still does not have answers to at the point we've gotten to.
Okay.
Whereas the show, I believe, gives you answers this season.
Okay, maybe. We'll get into that. The show, it adds up. So this is another scene that they add. Basically, all the Cersei stuff, a lot of Cersei stuff is added in the show. And here's an example where we kind of have this particularly venomous scene where it's Cersei and Joffrey, and we now are 100% understand that he's like very petulant and frankly stupid. And then you can kind of see how she's sort of enabling this behavior through kind of what she says. And she ends that with like this quote, which is, "Everyone who isn't us is an enemy," you know?
Yes.
So we get that. And then we also get another scene with Cersei this episode where it's sort of another sex scene, believe it or not. This is with Cersei and Jaime. And he says that he will kill everyone else until they are all that remains. So there's that. And then we also get another scene. Now, this is a very good scene. Where it's King Robert and Jaime and Varys and Selmy, and they're talking about like their first kills that they ever made. And that is just like it's a scene that's not really necessary in the sense that it doesn't move the plot forward, but it is really good psychological scene. And I really love how it kind of introduces this idea that because we've never seen Jaime show any respect toward anyone ever. Like in the show, we literally just heard him tell Cersei that he will kill everyone else in the world. But he is showing some deference and respect to Varys and Selmy here, which I think elevates him and like his status. It makes you like, wow, if even Jaime Lannister of all people has respect for this guy, that's significant.
I mean, he's just so cool, but he's also an interesting, not quite foil, but a little bit to Jaime Lannister as a Kingsguard, because he was also a Kingsguard for King Aerys and saw all the same horrible things that Jaime did, but was loyal to the end, did the honorable thing
Right.
by never turning on him. And well, I guess I'll stop there for now.
Okay, yeah. And but it also kind of creates a juxtaposition between, because like to Robert, I mean, he's definitely haunted a little bit by what he did, but he's kind of trying to play it off as a joke. Whereas like when Varyson's talking about his first kill, he doesn't really go into a whole lot of detail like Robert does. And he also
It's a lot more respectful.
Yeah, and he also is just like, that playing it off as a joke. So anyway, that's an excellent scene that I'm glad that they added to the show. There's, like I said, there's a lot of good stuff that they did add. But we also have kind of moving up this first confrontation that Daenerys has with Viserys. So again, it's a little bit out of order with the book, but it's essentially the same thing that happens. Although the show is kind of like I don't know. It's like I feel like it's kind of a weird scene in the show where she like sees how they're sort of mistreating their slaves, and then she just like gets off her horse and walks into the woods for some reason. Like it's not that she's like gets off and it's like, hey, you can't treat those people that way. She just like wanders off.
She's like, stop the like, I guess she just needs to cool off.
Yeah, I don't
but she
know.
doesn't actually do anything about it.
And then Viserys runs in and he's like super pissed off that she commanded him, although she didn't really, but she commanded the party to stop. And then he's like gets totally humbled by one of those Dothraki guys.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the beginning of where you kind of see the power has shifted more in her favor. over him. So important scene, but again, they kind of move it forward here. And then they also reveal this episode that she's pregnant. It's probably similar in the book. I actually didn't even like when I'm taking my notes in the book, I'm just writing down stuff that I think is significant, and I probably just didn't even bother writing that because it's obvious part of her arc that she gets pregnant with Drogo's son. But I'm sure that that's pretty similar. We do get in the show, it's very clear. Like Drogo or Jorah has a very clear reaction to this news, and then we see him like riding out. So
Yes.
essentially, to report back to Varys at King's Landing what's going on. But they kind of make a point of noting that that is going on here in the show, although they don't come right out and say it, obviously.
It's harder to suss out that Jorah is a spy.
Well, because
in the
in this scene, Daenerys is not there. Her handmaiden comes into where Jorah is and says she's pregnant, and Jorah rides off. So there's no way that Daenerys could have seen that happen. Which is whose perspective we have in the book. We have Tyrion pissing off Alistair Thorne to the amusement of the Night's Watch officers. And then he speaks with Commander Mormont about the needs of the Night's Watch, and Commander Mormont's kind of saying, hey, we need more people up here. And he travels up the wall one last time and kind of has his farewell with Jon Snow. In the show, this is much more split up, obviously, because they split they kind of take chapters and split them up over the course of an episode instead of just doing it all at once with one character at a time.
Which might say something about how much they trust their audience's attention span.
Definitely. So instead of, he doesn't like really piss off Alice, talking about Tyrion, he doesn't really like have this kind of spat with Alistair in the show. Instead, he's like bonding with Yoren, which is equally important because Yoren is a important character in the first couple seasons. And they're like getting along and kind of having a grand old time. And then Benjen Stark kind of comes in and is like kind of a killjoy, and he's getting ready to set out past the wall. Yes. And then instead of so I guess it's like after that, then he has the meeting with Mormont. And also, I don't know if he's there in the book, but Maester Aemon is there for that scene where he's talking with Mormont.
And he doesn't
in the show
take seriously any supernatural claims of threats beyond the wall, but he does all the same take them more seriously than anyone else we see for a while in terms of, okay, they need some stuff. I'm going to make an honest effort to get them what they need.
So then Arya makes a scene at dinner. She's still upset about the death of Micah and then also what she had to do to Nymeria. So Ned kind of has this talk with her and tells her that they need to stand together as a family, and finds out about Needle, and she kind of begins in the book right here. She goes ahead and begins her training with Syrio. This is all condensed into one chapter in the book. So obviously very out of order with the show, where the dinner scene actually happens before Catelyn arrives at all. The show, like they're having this dinner and Catelyn hasn't even showed up yet. And then the episode ends with Arya beginning her training with Syrio. That's like what they tried to make the big ending scene there. But in the book, we also have kind of Daenerys coming more into her own as the Khaleesi. And we kind of have that scene where the Dothraki guy almost kills him. It's actually her, I think, in the book that makes him walk. Whereas in the show, it's that Dothraki guy tells him to walk.
Okay.
And then she has this dream in the book of King's Landing burning, and then she has sex with Khal Drogo again. But this is actually in the book. So, fair enough. I guess they could have had, they did have a little bit of that going on in the book as well. Okay, episode 104 is Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things. This is chapters 24 through 29. It starts with Bran again. He's looking out of his window and he's watching Rickon play with the wolves, and he's upset that he can't. We have more with him and Old Nan, who he has come to resent at this point. And she's beginning a story that sounds a lot like Bran's future. But then she's interrupted by Maester Luwin and Hodor, and they bring him down to meet Tyrion Lannister, who is coming through as he, with his with Yoren and the other guys as they're kind of passing through again after leaving the wall. Tyrion gives the Maester a design for a saddle that Bran can use, which he's very excited by. Again, we have a scene in the book where the wolves arrive and they nearly attack Tyrion. They do not like him, but the Starks call him off. And then Tyrion goes ahead and leaves after that, but Yoren actually stays, along with a few other of the Night's Watch guys. They stay and they kind of have a nice night and a dinner with the Starks, which is cool. None of this is in the show. And then that's kind of where they break the news to Robb that Benjen's missing. And then there's just like this really great scene where Rob sits with Bran that night, and they say that they're going to ride out together soon to see John at the wall, and they kind of hold hands and cry over Benjen being missing and
Oh,
stuff.
my heart.
And like this is just not in the show really at all. Like in the show, what we have is we do have like the old man thing being introduced, interrupted by Theon and Hodor. Oh, it's Theon and Hodor instead of the Maester that
Mm,
come in. And Theon kind of insults old man like he does to everybody back in this era of his life.
of course.
And then we totally skip over Bran being jealous of Rickon playing with the wolves. We totally skip over the wolf attack on Tyrion, and the dinner and the Christ session with Rob. All that is just cut from the show. We do have the time though for Theon to talk to Tyrion about having sex with Roz
Great.
because
Perfect.
priorities. So glad we can fit that in.
Uh,
I think this episode might have been the most egregious, as we'll talk about later, of some of that stuff.
okay.
Like it was like I think this chunk was significantly worse than this chunk in the book in the show. So then we have Ned speaking with Grandmaster Pycelle about the circumstances around John Aaron's death, but he doesn't really learn anything else other than he had asked for a book the day he died, or the day before he took ill, and the phrase "the seed is strong." And then which means nothing to him at this point.
Sure.
He returns to his dwelling and he sees Arya practicing her balance. So it's actually not with Syria there, but she's just practicing her balance.
Doing her homework.
Yeah, and then he meets with Littlefinger, who warns him most of the city is made of spies, and he points out a couple while he's doing that. And he also tells Ned of 4 people that knew John Arryn that he should question, and they are Sir Hugh is kind of the first one. So he sends. Or I guess that's kind of all we get at this point. But like Sir Hugh is like first on his list.
Okay.
People to talk to. So then we go to the Castle Black.
Squired for
who was the squire for John.
John
So we move to Castle Black. We have Sam's arrival at Castle Black. And he gets beaten up at the command of Sir Alistair. All that's the same. Jon Snow's what?
Did you want to name the other 3 people?
Well, Jon Snow steps in along with Pip and Gren to defend him. So
Or
that's
the other 3 that Ned was warned about or to talk to.
Oh, well, we'll kind of get to him, I think. But like,
Okay.
I don't even know if he even he says 4 people.
But he doesn't name
I don't
them
even
yet.
know. He might, but in my notes, I just noted Sir Hugh the Squire. That's number 1 on the list.
Okay, sorry. So Jon Snow being badass.
Yes.
Stepping up for our boy.
That night, he kind of makes friends with Sam, and they kind of tell each other about their histories and their nightmares. And John goes to bed realizing he's found a brother, I think is how they phrase it in the book. This is, of course, more split up across the episode in the show. And then the show also adds this awesome scene where we have Rast, who's no good, and he's
The sweetling.
he says that he is going to hurt Sam, as a matter of fact, and that leads to him being visited that night and bound while Ghost threatens to rip his throat out. So that's pretty great. Ned is annoyed by his tourney that's rapidly approaching. He's mulling over this boring book that Pycelle's given him. And then
It's basically just like genealogy.
yeah, just basically like the Bible where they go into like all the son of this and then the son of this and all that. Janos Slynt kind of comes in and requests more men that are to kind of join the Night's Watch until the tournament ends because all these people are coming in. So he agrees to. Actually, he just kind of delegates that to Jory. He's like, pick 20 men to help him.
He's the commander of the King's Guard. Or, I'm
Yes.
sorry, not the King's Guard. The Gold Cloaks.
Gold Cloaks, yeah.
City Watch.
We actually don't get him visiting Sir Hugh. He is visiting the Smith, Gendry. And we just kind of know that he was sort of on the list, I guess. But then pretty quickly, Ned's like, oh yeah, that's one of Robert's bastards, no question about it. He just looks at him and he knows, which is significant.
Yes.
Callan and Roderick stop at an inn at the crossroads where they have this chance encounter with Tyrion Lannister in the party. And at this point, she thinks that he is behind the assassination attempt on Bran. So given everyone in there was from a house little to tell that she has them capture Tyrion. So that is not, that's the big closer for the episode, but it's not the closer of this sequence, like in order with the book. It's just, that happens at this point. Then instead we have the Sansa chapter where she's watching the Hands tournament and she's having a great time.
It's everything she dreamed
Yeah. And then, the mountain kills Sir Hugh and that's kind of disturbing, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of gets you crashing back down to reality of.
But it's not all lost because at the feast, Joffrey is nice to her. So that seems like it's looking up. But then the Hound takes her back to her room, and it's during that trip that he tells her how he got his burns, and she is sad for him. But then whenever they get up to her room, he says he'll kill her if she tells a soul about that story. So that is actually different than in the show, because you remember who tells her about the Hound in the show?
Littlefinger.
It's Littlefinger in the show, yeah.
And he tells her that he'd probably kill anyone.
Right. So
Mention that story.
yeah, in the book we get it from the Hound's mouth that he will kill anybody that tells that story. So that's kind of an interesting change. He's a lot more in the background, I would say, in the show until like the end of season 2. More so than in the book, I think.
Yeah.
In the book, like he has more interactions with Sansa than he does in the show, I think.
I agree. And I think their relationship is interesting. She's terrified of him, but she pities him, and he does have these moments of kindness with her.
Well, he does save her life multiple times.
Sure.
But yeah, it's clear that he has a soft spot for her. And he might even, kind of be more into her than, would be appropriate. But he does, he just kind of puts that to the side, I think.
Yeah.
But he definitely sticks up for her whenever he can.
But she when she first met him was terrified to the point of shaking and was enamored with Joffrey. And then turned out that who she should be scared of wasn't exactly who she thought.
So yeah, like I kind of talked about we talked about those changes. She really doesn't spend any time with Joffrey during this sequence in the show. So I kind of like that more, the seesaw situation where she has in the book, where she kind of has some hope at this point. Whereas in the show, she's already very depressed because Joffrey's upset after his arm got torn up by that wolf. And that was just a disaster.
Yes. I mean, she's grieving lady.
Yeah, that too. Both. She's also mad about that. So the show, at this point, the show has completely given up on the idea that Joffrey has any redeeming qualities. Whereas in the book, she's still trying to believe that he does. So I guess the show was just nobody's going to buy that, so why even waste time for that? And then between all of this, the show adds what I would say is probably the most egregious and unnecessary scene, maybe in the entire show's history. Certainly in all of season 1, where it's just Viserys with that handmaiden in the bath, and they're talking about dragons.
Some sex position.
Sex position is exactly what it is. But the dragon lore does nothing for us at this stage. The dragons are just in their eggs.
I guess they're just trying to hype up dragons or add a little reminder that there's magic in this world.
Yeah, I think they were kind of hoping that would be an interesting hook for people. But I think it would have worked just as well without this scene, as I think this scene is completely unnecessary.
Sure.
And then it also moves up and abbreviates the sequence. I think this is better in the book for sure, where Viserys hits Daenerys for this gift of clothing that she's kind of had made for him.
Dothraki style clothing.
Right. And then she basically says, do that again and you will lose your hands. So that's kind of the first time she's really talking back to him.
Because she's been able to adapt to this culture and become more accepted, whereas he is very stuck in what he thinks is more dignified, and it backfires on him. He's not able to bond with these people that he needs.
Yeah. So this scene between him and her actually does not happen for some time in the book. This is another thing that they moved up. And it's also much shorter in the show, and I think worse, where in the book you get this whole thing about she's really excited to give him this gift, and she's really trying to bring him into the culture. And in the show, he just shows up and he's pissed off. We don't really understand what he's even mad about. Which, I think he's not a great character in either medium, but I do think he's weaker in the show than he is in the book.
I don't know. He's pathetic and he's detestable, but also it is an interesting. I think he does have kind of an interesting psychology of how he got to the point he's at.
Yeah, I
he
just
feels
disagree.
Very entitled, but also hasn't had a lot. Has been running, and I think in the same way that Daenerys does, sees King's Landing and rising to the throne as a home, as a landing point, where he can finally be safe and have the life he thinks he deserves. And he does have a bond with Daenerys because they were on their own and they were all each other had for so long. Even though he is terribly abusive, you can see he's insecure, and I mean, it's just he's a pitiful character, but there is some depth there for such a sadistic fuck.
I agree all that's there. I disagree that it's compelling.
Okay.
And then the show adds a scene. Oh yeah. Oh boy, this is another bad addition. So they add this scene with Sansa and Asepta where it's just basically them doubling down on Sansa being unlikable. Like this is I think where she asks her a question. He's like, "Oh wait, I just remembered I don't care," and like just very out of character for her in the book.
Yeah.
So that's very annoying. Then it has a scene where this is all new in the show. It has a scene where Jory's trying to deliver this letter to Robert. That's like a request from Ned or something, but he's too busy having sex with a bunch of whores, and Jamie's standing outside guarding him, and he's annoyed, and he refuses to take it. So that's not in the books, obviously, because none of those are point of view characters. And then finally, it adds a scene between Cersei and Ned where they kind of feed each other some loosely veiled threats that I guess is just there to kind of try to heighten the tension, but it's ultimately just kind of a waste of time.
What else happened in that scene with Cersei and Ned?
Basically, nothing at all.
Okay.
She kind of gets wind. So clearly, she's kind of getting some wind that he's sort of doing the same investigation that John Aaron was, and she's like, "Oh, it didn't work out too good for him, or whatever." But it's just we get the tension that we need between those characters. We already have it, first of all, with the whole thing with the direwolf, and um, basically, she's the reason that they killed Nymeria, or not Nymeria, lady. And then we get it more later on, where he kind of comes to her with some information that he gleans. And so I just like this scene just doesn't really do anything to advance the story in any way, or is a very good scene between them. Like if it was like a great scene, like the one with Robert and his King's Guard, kind of talking about their first kills, like that's I think worth including. But this one I don't, I guess.
Well, clearly it didn't stick out to me, so you probably
Yeah,
have
exactly.
a point.
So that's the end of this sequence of the for the chapters. I'm struggling to even remember what their big closing point for the show is the arrest of Tyrion. So they just kind of moved that back, and I guess that was definitely the most interesting thing that happened in this section. So
Now, in the show, it is a little less close for Catelyn than it is in the books. Like in the show, it looks like pretty much everybody stands up when she asks. Whereas in the books, it's very clear, like the Freys don't stand up. She gets
important.
like just enough of the bannermen to stand up for her. Catelyn gets a lot of shit for this decision.
Well, it is a horrible decision.
Well, we have hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, which really shows how flawed it was. But if Tyrion had gone back and said, like, hey, Catelyn's here, that would have really maybe gotten Ned into a lot of trouble. I think that if she had brought Tyrion to Riverrun instead of the Vale, she would have had a lot more success. And then just like said, I was going to the Vale, just like she did with Riverrun.
I don't think there was any way for this to be successful. This is what spurs Tywin to the field. This is what spurs Jaime to attack Ned. This is just a disaster.
But I think it would have been a disaster if Tyrion was let go and reported back on
she should have
Catelyn being there. That's like a huge tip off that the Starks are up to something.
Well, he's still got a long way to go, though. I don't think it would have inspired war. I think they would have been like, I wonder what's going on with that.
Well, war was coming either way, I think.
Based on what?
Well, this is all the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters brewing.
Yeah, there was definitely some tension. I mean, it probably would have happened when Ned found out the truth about the Cersei's children, but like that would have taken a lot. He might have had a greater chance of success with that because, and not that Tywin's there when it happens, but like Tywin would have had to start from nothing. Like he wouldn't have been out in the field already if there wasn't his arrest. So it is an objectively terrible decision that she makes.
Okay.
So for
I just don't think it was as dumb as people read for.
Episode 5, we have the wolf and the lion. Ned speaks to Robert as he prepares to take part in the day's melee and is heartened that he still has his friend. That he's satisfied by that interaction between the two of them. Where in the show he's bullying Lancel. He attends the finals of his tourney with Sansa, and then he watches as the Hound defeats Jaime and the Mountain, but loses to Loras Tyrell and nearly kills him. The Hound saves Loras, and then the young knight gives him the day. So I guess in the record books, it's the Hound that wins, ultimately.
Very, very nice.
Yes. Later that night, Ned is visited by Varys, who basically confirms his fears that the Lannisters had Jon Arryn poisoned and, well, in his mind confirms them, and plans to move against Robert. And he also reveals that it was Hugh that poisoned him, and then that the Lannisters had the Mountain kill him as a cover-up. And then he asks a question, why did Jon Arryn have to go? Kind of trying to get him to think.
Give him a little nudge.
So Tyrion learns that Catelyn is actually taking him to the Eyrie instead of Winterfell, which is what she announced, which is to his dismay, because any potential help that could have heard about it would be heading in the wrong direction. He also learns the lie, frankly, of his involvement in Bran's attempted assassination, and that came from Littlefinger, and he starts trying to poke holes into that story. Then the party is attacked by mountain men, and Tyrion actually saves Catelyn during the attack, and he kills his first man. So all that is pretty much the same. Arya chases Cats in King's Landing, and she actually runs into Myrcella and Tommen in this sequence in the book, which does not happen in the show. So another example of them kind of cutting those characters until much later.
You also see, it's probably one of the least favorable lights you see Myrcella and Tommen in, because they're a little bit rude to Arya. And you get to see, like, you normally see them as like these sweet little kids, but to what they think of as a commoner, they definitely are a little elitist. And
yeah, I'm sure she looks like shit running around chasing those cats.
Oh, absolutely. So it's an interesting insight into like what privilege does to people. Obviously, we see what growing up knowing he was going to have unchecked power did to Joffrey in conjunction with having Robert and Cersei as his role models.
Yes. So anyway, rather than explaining herself, she escapes. So in either scene, she finds herself in this tunnel below the keep, where she hears Varys, and at the time we don't know who he's talking to. He's talking to someone else, discussing basically the greater forces at work, including Daenerys and Ned's investigation into Jon Arryn's death. She actually tries to warn Ned about this when she returns to the keep, but that conversation is interrupted by Yorn, who arrives, who brings him the news of Benjen's disappearance. And also the news that Catelyn has detained Tyrion, neither of which is good news.
And in the books, you can infer that it's Varys, but Arya doesn't know that either.
Oh, yeah. Well, because he's a much more established character at this point.
Yes.
Than Illyrio.
Is he in disguise at that? He wears disguises a lot in the books, which they eliminated from the show.
Yeah, he probably is. But he's also he might not feel it's necessary because they're below the keep and nobody really goes down there unless they're chasing cats.
Sure.
Ned and Robert kind of have this blow up where Ned kind of is refusing to be part of the assassination attempts on Daenerys. And he quits as the Hand and prepares to make a hasty departure from King's Landing, which probably would have been better for all involved. But Littlefinger visits him and promises to take him to the brothel that Stannis and Jon Arryn were investigating the night before he died.
How nice of him.
Yes. Catelyn arrives in the Vale with a significantly smaller party than the one she left the inn with in the books. They make kind of a point of pointing that out. She meets her uncle Brendan, who is really a background character in the show. He's much more important in the books at this stage.
Brendan the Blackfish.
Yeah. And he kind of takes the party toward the Eyrie. I don't think he's in the show at all for this sequence. So then we have Lysa. Then she sends word. So I guess it's kind of more work. They kind of just skip over all this in the show, which is understandable. But it's kind of more work to climb up there.
Oh, it's
in the book. So
it really goes to show how or why the Eyrie is impenetrable.
Yeah, but her sister sends word that you need to climb up here right now, this night. And so she leaves. She actually leaves Tyrion behind, and climbs up the Eyrie herself and gets some help from Maya Stone, who I don't remember who that is, but she's obviously a bastard.
Yes, one of Robert's.
Oh, okay. And she finally sees her sister and sees that she's in rougher shape than she had been previously. She has this pathetic 6-year-old son, and he's older in the show, suckling at her teats. And then Lysa is just like mad at her for bringing a Lannister to her doorstep.
She's very protective, really does not want any threats anywhere near her son,
Yes.
who is sickly and she lost other children. And so there's some stuff there that makes sense
Yeah.
psychologically. Her husband has been killed.
Yes. So, like I said, this has kind of changed a bit in the book. It's moved a lot faster, and then also Tyrion is in attendance for their first meeting. And then he's locked in the moon cell by Mord. So we have that. Ned goes with Littlefinger to see another of Robert's bastards. This one is mothered by a young redhead. On the way back to the Red Keep, Jamie and 20 men stop him, and Jory and Will are with him, which are bigger characters in the book than in the show.
Sure.
Jamie does not kill Ned, but his men do kill Jory and Will. In the fighting, Ned's horse falls on him, which breaks one of his legs.
Yes.
Littlefinger brings the City Watch, who takes Ned back to the keep. This is all stuff that is just we don't even see in the show. Littlefinger brings the City Watch, takes Ned back to the keep, and Pycelle gives him some milk of the poppy, his favorite administration.
Sure.
So this is different in the show. I think it takes place at a different time of day. In the book, it's like at night when this little sequence takes place, which just kind of makes a little more sense than going after the hand in broad daylight, which is what happens in the show. And it is the guy stabs Ned's knee in the show, how he sustains his injury instead of the horse flying on, which I do think is better, actually. It's like more dramatic, and we get a little bit more of like Jamie's psychology where he's like mad at that guy and punches him. And, you know, they were definitely trying to make Ned look a little more badass instead of just being this idiot oaf that his horse falls on his leg, which I think is better. It makes it more dramatic and entertaining.
Sure. I do think that George R. R. Martin tries to make things feel a little bit more real. And in real life, some things are accidents. Some people die of stomach issues or whatever. That's not typically the interesting stuff that we like to see in TV. Or
Right. So a justifiable change for the show, I would say.
sure, I'm all right with that.
Daenerys and the Dothraki arrive at Vias Dothrak. And then Khal Drogo kind of goes off and does whatever his sacred stuff is for his people. And this is where in the book Daenerys is planning to give this gift to Viserys, and she's excited about it. And then he shows up, and he's an asshole as usual. And then he earns himself a strike across the face for Daenerys. So this is the first time that she actually hits him.
It's very satisfying.
And then in the book, she goes to sleep cradling one of her dragon eggs. So I'm sure that was very cozy. So let's see. That part like I already talked about is moved up, and it's like in the previous episode. And then the show, he's kind of pissed off for no reason, and you know.
I think it was because she had one of her handmaidens summon him
to
bring him so that she could give him the gift, and he was like, "How dare you summon me?"
Whatever. He sucks. Then there's also guess what? Some unnecessary sex scenes that the show added in this one. This one with Theon and Roz.
Oh boy.
2 great characters. But it makes up for this with the first of the show's original scenes with Varys and Littlefinger kind of having some
that's such a good one.
They're each kind of trying to one up each other with the show. They kind of are showing that they have knowledge without tipping their hands about their goals.
Takes place in front of the Iron Throne.
Yeah. That's very good. Then we have also added sex. Well, to be fair, this is not a sex scene, but it is an added scene with Renly and Loras where he's like shaving him or whatever in the show. And so it's like very clear that he's gay in the show. Whereas like in the book, I like that they keep it a little bit. It's also very clear, but they keep it at least. It's not like in your face,
Yeah, it's definitely a better kept secret. Or just it's never outright said. Like he's got his rainbow guard, which they absolutely should have kept in the show, where each of his Kingsguard is a different color of the rainbow.
Yeah.
It is interesting to see a little bit of insight into their relationship.
I agree with that. I think, well, the relationship itself, I'm not really that interested in.
Their psychology.
But I do think that they should take every chance they can to get more insight into Renly himself. So I'm good with that. And they are talking about how he would be a better king, and
this makes some solid arguments.
Yeah, they're kind of setting the stage for that, which is good and important. I'd rather them just be having the conversation, I think, than him be shaving him and it'd be like trying to be like this erotic thing.
Sure.
Because it would be like they'd have more plausible deniability about it. But so that one kind of splits the difference. It's like obviously not useless like the Roz and Theon scene, not amazing like the Littlefinger and Varys scene. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. But we also get another really great scene, which is between Robert and Cersei, and I love this scene a lot, where they're they actually kind of have a laugh together about how ridiculous their marriage is and like how that's the thing holding the country together.
That
Um,
scene is definitely one of the best
that they
additions
added.
that the show made.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then that conversation doesn't end there either, because then like they kind of have this serious conversation about Lyanna Stark, and um Rob's like, I don't even remember what she looked like. And that's like a really big admission from him. And she asks him like, could our marriage have ever worked? And he's like, no.
Because she was uh optimistic about it at the very beginning. She was supposed to marry Rhaegar and she was excited about that. He was a handsome prince. She had a little bit of uh the Sansa optimism at
Right.
that time. And Robert was an accomplished warrior. He was handsome and renowned,
Hmm.
and
Badass.
he just couldn't get over this woman he knew for like 2 days.
Yeah, she really must have been something.
I mean, he could get over it to like go to a bunch of whorehouses and
Right.
father 20 bastards, but not enough to make a solid effort in his marriage. And I get it. She's Cersei. Like, she's a hard one to love.
Yes. But
But
anyway, the great scene. So that episode overall, some great stuff they added, even though there was like the kind of unnecessary scene with Theon and Ross. But overall, much better than the episode that came before. Episode 106 is A Golden Crown. This actually covers a lot of ground. This is chapters 37 through 46, so like 10 chapters here is covered in this sequence. It starts with Bran, Robb, Theon, Maester Luwin, and a contingent of guards going for a ride beyond Winterfell. They always start with Bran. At the Ironwood Forest, Robb tells Bran of what has happened with their parents, because at this point, obviously, Ned's injured. Robb goes off to find Summer and Greywind at one point, and then like these 6 wildlings threaten Bran. They're all killed by Robb and the direwolves and Theon, except Osha, who they take for questioning. Theon saves Bran with when a man had a dagger to his throat with a well-placed arrow, but that pisses off Robb since he could have missed.
mm-hmm.
So that's
Which would have been disastrous for Bran.
right. So then we get Tyrion suffering in the Moon Cell. And he promises gold to Mord if he carries the message to Lysa Arryn that he wishes to confess. When he's brought before the court, he does not confess. He denies his involvement in Bran's attempted assassination and the death of Jon Arryn. He demands a trial, but Lysa says that the judge will be Robert, her son.
Yeah.
Or Robin, not Robert.
His
So
name is different in the show.
oh, okay. So it's Robert in the book.
Yes, it's Robert Arryn, but then she calls him Sweet Robin.
Got it.
And in the show, they simplified it so that he was not named after the king.
Great. So then Tyrion demands his trial by combat. And first he names Jaime, but he's denied because he's too far away. Lysa appoints Vardis Egan as his opponent. And then Bronn stands up as Tyrion's champion. So we get all that. Ned awakens after a week from the Milk of the Poppy stuff. And he actually, in the book, very significantly, he's dreaming about the Battle of the Tower of Joy.
Yes.
Which has moved many seasons forward in the show. We don't get any of that here. He meets with, we even get like Promise Me Ned and everything in the book.
Yes.
We don't know what this is like. Basically, he's at his sister's deathbed. We don't know what she's asking him to promise her.
Lots of clues in this dream sequence
Right.
for later.
I'm not really not a huge fan of dream sequences in general. I think that George R. R. Martin overuses them, but this is a interesting one for sure because it's not something that's like, oh, this sort of metaphysical thing, prophecy thing. It's like, yeah, this really happened, and we don't know exactly what's going on there, which is a lot more interesting, I think. So anyway, he gets his ass out of bed. He meets, well, actually, in the show, I think he's in bed, but he meets with Robert and Cersei. Cersei wants him dead, because of the fact that Tyrion has been captured, even though he really didn't have anything to do with that. But he says that he does.
What a loyal sister.
Yeah. And Robert hits her for her thoughts, sends her away, and he renames Ned Hand of the King and says he's about to go off on a hunt.
It's really one of the only times you see Robert's darker side in the show. They kind of keep him more comedic or
yes.
Well,
he's clearly like a
cooler.
great character. Like he's brutally bullies that Lannister kid, Lancel.
Yes.
And he's obviously whoring around and not faithful to his wife at all.
But all of that is kind of played for laughs in the show.
Yeah.
Whereas in the books, Ned is throughout the book coming to terms with Robert is not the man that he left.
But in both cases, he's trying to have Daenerys killed, which is great to us.
Yes.
Because we're supposed to like Daenerys. Most people do.
Sure. I did at this point with
Okay.
my first watch through.
The show actually adds an additional scene of Arya training with Syrio. Good addition, I think, because they should build up that relationship as much as they can, considering it's very important for Arya's character.
Yes.
And then it also adds a scene of Robert actually on the hunt itself, which famously George R. R. Martin did not like this scene
Well, it
because it's
was
like
a critical little hunt.
three guys walking through the woods.
They try to make up for that in a hunt in
House of
the
the Dragon.
prequel.
Yeah.
House of the Dragon.
But this is obviously that hunt is we get nothing from that hunt in the book because no point of view characters are there.
Yes.
I actually think it's a good addition because it kind of foreshadows that. Well, Robert's like he's having some drinks on this. He's indulging a bit on this hunt.
Yes.
So I think it's actually important to show. And I understand it's such a small scene, so I certainly don't blame them for not going all out on this, situation. And you could surmise that maybe the large party was still back at their tents and things, because that is a thing in House of the Dragon. There's definitely still more people with him whenever he kills the stag or whatever, but when he goes off in the woods, there's not as many people there.
Sure. I mean, they could use some like horse noises or
Yeah.
implied there were a lot more people around than there were, but whatever.
Tyrion's trial by combat happens. And I really like how it's presented in the book, actually, because it's from Catelyn's point of view. And she kind of reflects on this battle that Littlefinger had in her honor against Ned's brother Brandon, which is who she was originally betrothed to. And then Brandon just absolutely eviscerates him. And
Doesn't she watch it out the window? Is that right?
no, she's there, I think.
Okay.
I think she might look out the window at times while she's like thinking about her past. And probably not interested in seeing this guy get killed. But yeah, Brandon, like in her history, Brandon just completely destroys Littlefinger's ass. And Braun pretty much whoops Varys Egan as well. But yeah, none of the flashback stuff is included in the show, which I understand that would have been kind of hard to convey, but it's really good in the show or in the book. I really like that was there.
Yes, absolutely. Has really great chapters.
100%, yeah. So anyway, Tyrion wins. So Lysa Arryn tells Tyrion and Bronn that they're going to have to take the high road down from the Eyrie. And then that's kind of how we get there. There's more recruits on the way at Castle Black because of Tyrion's efforts and Yoren's efforts to recruit some more people. So Sir Alistair lets many of Jon's crew know that they are going to be inducted into the Night's Watch officially. And Jon's friends are excited, but he's actually really concerned about Sam during this sequence in the book. And he visits Maester Aemon and asks that he be named a steward.
I love that.
And I think the show skips all of that.
I think so too.
And it's understandable because like we already mentioned, like they're packing 10 chapters into this one episode. So I get that they're gonna have to make some cuts, but I do think it's clear that Jon has a soft spot for Sam. Like I guess they didn't really need to hit us over the head with that one again. But I do like that scene with Aemon where he's like he's gonna be a maester, right? Or not a maester. What is it?
A steward.
Steward, yes.
And the more scenes you get with Jon and Maester Aemon,
right,
the better.
Yeah, very important. Yeah. So anyway, we have Tyrion traveling down the mountain, and then they use a fire, which attracts a band of mountain men. I think in the book it's more implied that Tyrion does this on purpose, whereas in the show they are kind of more taken by surprise by the mountain men.
Yes. Well, I don't think Lysa expects them to survive this journey
Yeah.
because of the mountain men.
Right. So Tyrion convinces them to join him by promising them all the Vale. And this is actually not in this sequence in the episode because, like I mentioned, they already have a lot packed in here. So they bumped this to the 8th episode. So that means that it's bumped actually 2 episodes forward because we're in episode 6 right now. So I think we just don't get any Tyrion in episode 7.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. One of the few episodes he's not in.
Can't have an episode without Dany, though.
Yeah,
we will.
God forbid.
But...
so then we have Ned sitting on the throne whenever that guy comes in and says basically the mountain had destroyed some villages in the Vale and the Tully Bannermen want some revenge. So he sends, in the book, Thoros of Myr and Beric Dondarrion together. Also Gladden and Lothar. All the people that he sends off to figure out what's going on here. He needs to take down the mountain.
It's an example of him sending off people that he trusts, some of the remaining ones after Jaime killed a bunch of them.
Yeah, they're not his men, but they're men that he trusts.
Yes.
Sansa tells her, this is obviously only in the book, Sansa's talking to her friend Jane about what happened.
Jane Poole.
Yeah, because I think this scene is actually from Sansa's perspective. Like she's seeing him do this. So she tells her friend Jane about what happened. And then
And Jane is her best friend. Jane is also
yeah,
a little
Jane,
bit
cool.
meaner than she is. So some of the meanness
Mm,
to Arya of Jane called Arya Horseface and that kind of thing, they just put on to Sansa.
right. Questionable decision.
Yes.
And then they Sansa does get into an argument with Arya about what's going on with Joffrey, and for her efforts in that conversation, she gets a blood orange to the face from Arya. So there you go. This isn't. Oh, this is where they add the scene where she's like really cruel to the Septa. So I guess it's like a
Okay.
different scene where she's talking to Septa. She's not as cruel in that one, but she's still like complaining and whining and stuff. This one's where she's like, I don't care about you and your problems, the Septa. And then we also have a new Raw scene where she goes going after King's Landing like anyone cares. Sansa and Arya are later brought before Ned, who tells them he is sending them back to Winterfell by ship. They argue about the merits of Joffrey, and Sansa says he is nothing like his father. And so
Yes.
Ned is shook by this. He arranges a meeting with Cersei after confirming, it goes back to the book, and he just tells her, "I'm going to tell Robert the truth." This is all one episode in the book, which is very interesting.
Now we have a couple of mistakes here. One,
Yeah.
he couldn't trust his daughters with a little bit more information. He couldn't like explain to them anything uh, to make them understand a little bit more that they needed to go and not do anything they could to stay.
Well, they were going to go though. Like ultimately, he was going to get his way on that.
Well, not if Sansa had anything to say about
She
it.
didn't.
She did.
Oh well, sure, yeah, I see what you're saying.
And obviously telling Cersei that what he found
Yeah,
out.
horrible decision.
I think George R. R. Martin has said that Ned's fatal flaw was being so against the killing of children.
Right.
Because that's why he did it, was to try to save Joffrey and Marcella and Tommen, especially. And that was very kind of him, but also a little naive.
Yes. So the scene with Cersei is where he goes and tells her that. That's actually bumped to the next episode. It doesn't happen here.
Okay.
But it's all one chapter. It's a lively chapter in the book.
Right.
Then we have Daenerys eating the horse heart, and the oldest Khaleesi foretells that about her son being the stallion that will mount the world or whatever garbage. And then in the show, Viserys is disturbed by this and the love that she's inspiring in the Dothraki. And he actually attempts to steal her dragon eggs and run away, but is stopped by Jorah. And I think they just didn't bother showing that. Well, like it couldn't have in the book because he's not a point of view character.
Sure.
So then later at the feast celebrating the event, Viserys comes in and demands his crown, and we kind of know how that goes. He gets a crown, and he's dead.
The titular crown.
Yeah. And that's that. So that's the end of that. Moving on to the next episode. So remember the last one, we covered 10 chapters. Episode 107, 3. Chapters 47, 48, 49.
Wow. And what's it called?
You win or you die. One of the corniest lines in the history of the show. The episode actually starts with an added scene. It's a famous one. And it is Tywin Lannister carving up that buck.
Yes, which was taken from the story of Roose Bolton doing that while he threatens Sam and gets him to join the Night's Watch.
Really?
Or I'm sorry, not Roose Bolton.
Oh, it's his
Randall's Harley.
Yeah, Randall. Okay, got it.
His father.
Yes.
But another brilliant scene, one of the best additions
Definitely.
that the show makes.
It's obviously our introduction to Tywin, which we did not get here in the book, but we wait a little bit more before we're introduced to him. And it's a very different introduction. And then, so that's a great scene. And he's kind of berating Jaime while he's doing this.
Yes, definitely.
Awesome.
Lots of power plays going on.
Yeah. Then Ned has the scene where he tells Cersei that he knows her secret. And then we have another. This actually might be an even worse scene than this exposition with the dragons, where it is Littlefinger teaching Roz and some other whore how to do their jobs. And then
man, does that go on forever?
That goes on forever, and we gain absolutely nothing other than Littlefinger is a bad guy, which we already know. So, or even better, we don't know yet, and that can be even bigger surprise later.
Sure. It's a lot more obvious in the show that he's duplicitous than it is in the books. Like, no one suspects him in the books. Everyone underestimates him. Everyone thinks he's just kind of a funny guy that they can trust with money. because he's good, but they look down on him because of his background and they don't really think of him as a threat. He's very charismatic.
Which he is in both cases. But yeah, it's just a completely unnecessary scene. We also get another, I would argue, maybe not equally terrible, but bad scene where Theon threatens to rape Osha. Just not in the book at all, obviously. Then we have Ned being roused from his sleep in the book. In the show, he's just kind of walking down the hallway. And he is taking to Robert on his deathbed.
Oh.
Not good. The show moves up the scene with the assassination attempt on Daenerys and all the fallout that's dealing with that.
I don't remember us talking about the decision to try to assassinate Daenerys.
Well, we talked about how Ned's not going for it, and he quits over it.
Right.
So obviously they continue with that plan without him. So yeah, they move all that up where she's, they basically it's the poison wine or whatever, and then that results in Drogo like kind of going crazy, and he's like, well, because he's not really crazy about the whole idea about going to Westeros before this, but then after that guy almost kills her, he's like kind of has this newfound dedication to her.
And Jorah saves her because he knows it's coming, because he's a fucking spy.
So none of this is obviously in the book, but it does not happen here, which is interesting, because at this point, like they try to stop the assassination attempt, but Varys is like, well, it's probably already happened. She's probably dead as we speak, and so they just move it up for that reason, I guess. But yeah, the book that happens a little bit later. And then the show also adds another scene where Renly actually, like, I don't think this is in the book, where Renly asks Ned to back his claim, and Ned refuses.
Yes. And I mean, makes a solid argument. Like, things certainly would have gone better if Ned had.
For sure. So that's very interesting that was not in the book. But then what is the same? He kind of goes to his office. He's thinking about his next steps. He writes his letter to Stannis, fill him in what's going on. He also calls for Littlefinger, and he asks for his aid in securing the loyalty of the City Watch. So that's a good decision. Jon Snow learns that he is going to be Mormont's steward at the kind of graduation ceremony, and he is furious.
Now, sorry to go back. Littlefinger at that point suggests that Ned
in the show, not in the book, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah, he says that he should go with Renly, right? Yeah, he says he should go with Renly.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in the show, he makes all the arguments in a way where he wouldn't
accept it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's an interesting point. I never thought of it that way, but you think that he made that suggestion so that he would reject it.
I just think that he is a persuasive man, and all of the arguments he made would not appeal to Ned whatsoever.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, the graduation ceremony. Sam's like, hey, you should be grateful. And the two of them go to the Weirwood Forest north of the Wall, and they're sworn in as brothers of the Night's Watch. Ghost returns from the woods carrying a black hand. All that's the same. Then, with Robert dead, Cersei and Joffrey seize the throne, and Littlefinger and the City Watch betray Ned, if you can believe it. And they kill the remainder of his men, which in the book we know some of them are Fat Tom, Cain, and Varley. Those are not named in the show at all, but those are characters that we've kind of come to know at this point in the book.
And some of the kids will think back on them at points in the future in the books, and they are more.
Yeah, I think Fat Tom in particular I already really liked him or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that ends in the same way. Good cliffhanger. Then episode 108, we have The Pointy End, which is chapters 50 through 57. So back more up to the standard of 7 or 8 chapters for an episode. We have Arya's lesson with Syrio interrupted by Meryn Trant and 5 Lannister guards. And Syrio tells her to run and proceeds to kick the ass of all the 5 Lannisters. But things are not looking too good for him against Trant in both mediums. But in both mediums, do not seem to get killed.
Although in the show, you can hear him screaming. You can hear him kind of going down. Okay. In the books, it's more ambiguous, but I do believe he died. Yeah, definitely.
Arya gathers her things, and then she makes her first kill when a sable boy attempts to capture her.
Yes.
Kills him with the needle. And then she goes down to the Dragon Crypt to hide, which we actually don't see that in the show. We can kind of guess that's where she's going, but she doesn't say that, obviously. She's just going to hide somewhere. Mm-hmm. The show adds a scene with Ned rotting in the dungeon, and he's visited by Varys. That's not in the book. It actually does happen. It does happen in the book, but it's later on, and there's only one. In the show, it happens twice.
Okay.
Sansa is kept under watch in Maegor. I love this sequence in the book. Sansa is kept under watch in Maegor's holdfast with Jane Poole. Yes. And then she this is after she's I guess she's like reflecting on the fact that she told Cersei of Ned's plan. Yeah, obviously she's reflecting because that's what caused Cersei to kind of get her ducks in a row.
Yeah, so it's a reveal that
She had revealed to Cersei that Ned had planned to send her and Arya back to Winterfell. So she's like stuck up in a room for 3 days, and then she's brought before Cersei after that. And that's where she asked her to send the letters to her family, and asking them to swear fealty to Joffrey, and she agrees to do that. And then Jane Poole is put in the care of Littlefinger, which does not sound good.
Yes, Cersei didn't know that Sansa wasn't alone. And that's a really interesting dynamic because Jane Poole is crying the whole time.
Mhm.
Her father has been killed, which I think she knows, and she's
Yeah,
devastated.
because all the northern guys are like dead at this point, pretty much.
And Sansa is a little fed up with it.
Mhm.
She's
That's
a little
true.
annoyed by all Jane's crying. But then when Jane is gone,
Then she really misses her.
yeah,
Yeah.
she feels really empty. So it's
Yeah, obviously none of the Jane Poole stuff's in the show. But we do get a different scene where it's Rob's reaction to getting the letter, which is like, very exciting. And he tells Maester Luwin to call the banners.
yes.
And Maester Luwin even is excited about it. Like he can't even contain how awesome it is.
I love Maester Luwin.
And then it also adds Catelyn with Lysa Arryn, asking for her aid, and Lysa Arryn refuses. So that was in the show. And then this is the point where we get to Tyrion and Bronn bringing in on the Mountain. So then we have Jon Snow, Sam, and Commander Mormont examining the corpses of two of Benjen's men that have been found and brought in. So Mormont has the party bring them back to be examined by Maester Aemon. And that's kind of all for that chapter. So that one probably goes pretty fast. Then
Probably a lot of hearing about
Oh no,
how old it
I was
is.
wrong. There's more. So upon returning, everyone learns about the death of Robert Baratheon and the imprisonment of Ned Stark. And Alistair Thorne's kind of laughing about it, and Jon attacks him and is imprisoned.
Mm.
And then that night, it's Othor was the Night's Watch guy. Becomes a white, and he attempts to kill Commander Mormont, but Ghost and Jon kill him.
Which saves John's ass because
Yeah, because he
could've
was in
gotten
trouble.
a lot of trouble for
Yeah,
attacking.
instead he gets a badass sword out of it.
Yeah. Good work, John.
Then we have a scene in the book where the Karstarks, which is the last of the Winterfell bannermen to arrive, meet with Robb. And they are getting ready to march to the Vale to aid in the fighting against the Lannisters that's going on there. And in the show, it's different. It's actually the Umbers that come. And that's the scene where Stormwind tears off his fingers for raising his knife or whatever. And
Yeah.
Robb says, doubtless he was going to cut my meat for me. And that guy says, your meat is bloody tough.
Yeah.
So honestly, a better scene in the show. It's very memorable and entertaining.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that it's the Umbers in the show instead of the Karstarks, which really are kind of the more significant house in the grand scheme of things, the way things go.
Sure. I mean, they're both important.
Well, yeah, but for what happens later, the Karstarks are more.
Certainly earlier, yeah.
Okay, so then we have Osha telling Bran that Robb is marching the wrong way, but off he goes. We have Daenerys and Jorah doing the poison scene. Basically, this is where it happens in the book. Jorah stops him from the poison because he knows about it.
What a hero.
Khal Drogo vows to conquer Westeros for a son. They start the march. Like I said, all of this was moved up. But instead, what we get here in the show, because we got to get some Daenerys, is Khal Drogo suffering his wound and Miri Miles Dur offering her assistance.
Yes.
So that's significant. We have Catelyn meeting Robb at Moat Cailin and learning of his plans to split his forces and march on Tywin Lannister. Like he kind of lays his cards on the table for her of what his plans are there. And so she, because what else is she going to do? She decides to travel with him.
Well, she could go back to her other.
Yeah, but she's probably pretty worried about his well-being here, marching off to war. So
sure. Well, and he could use her advice.
Definitely.
She's made some mistakes, but she has a lot of good insight for him.
Yeah. So then Tyrion arrives at his father's camp. This is actually how we're introduced to Tywin in the book. He arrives at his father's camp at the Trident, and he meets his, Tywin meets his new mountain men friends. And then we get a rider coming in informing him that Robb Stark is on the move, and Tywin and the Tyrion and the tribesmen prepare to meet them in battle. The show here adds a scene where a Lannister scout is caught and brought before Robb. And Robb lets him go, much to great Jon Umber's dismay.
Yes.
And tells him that he's like, tell Tywin Lannister that 20,000 Northerners is coming for him.
Well, he asked him how many he
Yeah,
counted,
yeah, right. And he says 20,000.
which is more than they have. And
More
so
than
he's
that.
like, okay, well, you can,
Tell him that we're coming for him.
yeah, which is clever. It was a
Yeah, it's
nice,
a great scene. Definitely should be there. I'm glad that is there.
nice moment of Rob's confidence.
Yeah. So Sansa attempts Joffrey's first court session. He commands the realm to kneel before him, and he names Tywin Hand of the King, and he names Janos Slynt Lord of Harrenhal, and he fires Barristan Selmy's ass.
Oh, the disrespect.
And then Sansa begs him for mercy for Ned, and he agrees on the condition he confesses his crimes, which is the end of the episode as well. And they kind of try to make this big cliffhanger. They try to make that more dramatic than it really is, I think. It's like this thing where it pans behind the throne and it fades out.
Well, to confess, Ned would have to lie.
Yeah, I know.
His
It's just
big thing is honor.
I just think I think it's ridiculous, like how they try to amp up the drama at the very last sequence of the show every episode.
Well, that's not exclusive to Game of
No,
Thrones.
it's not. Episode 109 is Baelor. We have Ned rotting in the dungeon, and he's visited by Varys. This does happen in the book this time, and he tells him to tell Cersei what she wants to hear for Sansa's sake. That's what he should do. That's his advice. Rob's army arrives at the Twins, and Catelyn meets with Walder Frey to convince him to let them cross. That's all pretty much exactly the same in both mediums. He agrees in exchange for Rob marrying one of his daughters upon his return, and Arya marrying his youngest son if she's found.
Yes.
But it's no guarantee.
And some squires and stuff.
Yeah, those are the two important things. Up in the north, we have Lord Commander Mormont giving Jon Snow Longclaw for saving his life. But Jon Snow is bitter that Mormont hadn't told him about Rob's rebellion. Our Rob's rebellion.
Yes.
And he tells Maester Aemon, or he has that kind of scene where Maester Aemon tells him, hey, I know what you're going through, pal. And he tells him about his heritage where he was a Targaryen. And he must choose between love and duty.
Brilliant stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really puts things in perspective for John, who was like, he can't possibly understand.
Yeah, he knows. He knows worse.
Bet.
At the site of a battle scene where Khal Drogo had killed Khal Ogo and his son, Daenerys stops the Dothraki from raping women and takes them for her own. This is obviously what was moved up to episode 8. And then one of them offers to help Khal Drogo with his wounds. Daenerys asks her to deliver the baby when the time comes. I don't think there's this big fight scene in the book where one of his guys turns on him and cuts him. I think he just is already wounded from taking that town.
I think so too.
Tyrion takes part in a battle in the book, which is different from the show, where Tywin Lannister's army goes against Robb Stark's. But before that, he spends the night with Shae, and she's introduced.
No, he does take part in the battle in the show. It's just not on screen.
No, he literally gets knocked out immediately, and it doesn't do anything.
Well, okay, but he's there.
Yeah, he's there.
He runs out on the field. They ran out of budget for that
It's one of the mountain men that knocks him out. It's not like an enemy.
Well, not on purpose.
Yeah, I know. But it's just, so in that sense, he did not really take part.
Sure. But it was just because the show ran out of budget for that battle.
But I love this kind of in the book. Overall, I think Tywin is, so far, obviously I haven't gotten anywhere near as much time as I'm going to in the books, but so far I think he's 100% stronger in the show than in the book. But I do really like this scene here where he is very proud of himself for that victory. He's because in the show, he immediately knows, okay, yeah, they tricked us. But in the book, he's kicked his ass, he's relaxing in his room.
Yeah, some lion pride.
Yeah, and then Adam Arbrand reveals it was a trick. And that Rob's main force has made for River Run, where Jaime was stationed. And so he's kind of knocked off his horse a little bit there in the book.
Because he couldn't wrap his head around a child outsmarting him.
Right. Now, in the show, it's really, all the stuff with Shae is really dragged out. They really want to put emphasis on that night that he spends with her. He's kind of falls in love with her. But then, in place of that, so that we'll get all that, and then the battle is cut. Because he actually does some stuff in the battle in the book. Not much, but he's in the battle, I think. Yeah, he doesn't. He's not in the battle at all in the show. He's knocked out as it begins. And then, like I said, Tywin's not gloating. He realizes that Robb fainted him. And then, in the show, in both actually, it immediately cuts to Robb, and he's taken Jaime Lannister prisoner, and along with some of his other men. So that's pretty great. And then we have Khal Drogo collapsing on a ride, and Daenerys takes him to his tent. Yeah. We have Mirri Maz Duur tells her that he is as good as dead, unless she uses some blood magic. And she does.
He had ripped off his salve, which she said not to do for at least however many days.
Okay.
So it's a little bit ambiguous whether,
Team up for the stabbing.
yes, or it's just like, well, you didn't listen to my instructions.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Daenerys agrees to this. She kills his horse and does their blood magic there. And then outside, there's like this big Dothraki revolt over this. It's led by Kotho, and he is killed by Jorah. And they do a better. You kind of get a more of a sense of who these guys are in the book because they have names and stuff.
Definitely.
Kaholo nearly kills Daenerys, but is killed by Aggo.
One of her blood riders.
Right, which is cut from the show. It's just Jorah saves her ass. And then
Gotta have Jorah being cool again.
and then Daenerys begins to miscarry during all this mess. And so Jorah takes her to the witch, because that's who's supposed to deliver the baby, while she's still performing the blood magic in a desperate move.
And in the book, I think she's actively like, fuck, no, don't do this.
Really? I don't remember that.
This is a terrible idea. She said don't do this.
Okay. And then we have Arya living on the street and plotting a way to escape King's Landing. And then she just kind of stumbles into the public execution of her father, which is very disturbing.
Well, I mean, everyone's going.
And she tries to save him, but Yoren intercepts her.
Which saved her life.
Which saved her life. Okay. That's the end of episode 9. A pretty good cliffhanger again. It was a successful one. Much more dramatic than he must confess his crimes or whatever.
Sure.
Okay, the finale here, episode 110, which is Fire and Blood, which takes us through chapters 66 through 72. So the show actually picks up right at the death of Ned. The blood's still dripping off the sword, very famously. And Yoren is like taking Arya under his wing, and he's disguising her by cutting her hair and pretending she's a boy. And then it also adds another scene later on where it's Arya and Gendry and Hot Pie leaving King's Landing with Yoren and the Night's Watch recruits. I think the book just kind of artfully skips over all that stuff. You kind of get the idea of what's going on. But, he's wrapping the book up at this point. So, like, he's kind of closing off all the characters. And I think he just leaves Arya for the next book at this point.
I mean, it's a pretty great ending for her, honestly.
Yeah. And then we have Bran telling Maester Luwin that he dreamed of his father in the crypt. And then there's a pretty good scene where this is in the book, where they journey down into the crypt, where with Osha, she's with him, and then they find Rickon and Shaggy Dog, who've already gone down there, and Shaggy Dog attacks Maester Luwin. Those damn wolves. The party returns to Lewin's tower, where he is treated by Osha for his wounds. And then he tells Bran of the history of the realm, kind of giving some exposition here. But then he's interrupted by the arrival of a hawk brandishing the message of Ned Stark's death. Obviously, this is cut down in the show, which is kind of understandable because it really isn't that important. But I think it actually is my favorite Bran chapter in the book. Because you get like kind of some psychology and between all the characters and kind of how they're all grappling with this news before it actually happens.
Yeah. Well, Maester Luwin is very like...
Yeah, he's dismissive of it. But he does
like,
go... Well, Maester Luwin is kind of great in this chapter because he's just like, oh, whatever, we'll go down in the crypt if it's going to make you feel better. And then he goes down there and he gets attacked by the wolf and he's just having a terrible time.
Yeah.
He's pissed off. And then he gets the news that actually, he is dead.
And Rickon also had the same...
That's why he's down.
Him go down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the show also adds a scene of Robb and Catelyn reacting to its death, which they did not have in the book. But Robb's like cutting up the tree.
Yeah. It's heart-wrenching.
Good scene that they had.
Because Catelyn is absolutely like, she holds it together.
Yeah, she holds it together until you get to the woods, and then she's just like has to like get rid of that immediately when she sees that Robb is suffering.
Yeah.
It's very good scene. I'm glad that they kept it or added it.
But in the books, there's an interesting dynamic with Catelyn and Robb where all of her motherly instincts, she like holds back until they're in private.
Right, but they are in private for that scene.
Yes. But you don't get to see any of her like compassion and mothering when he's trying to be lordly. So
then we have Sansa mourning Ned's death. And then she gets beaten up by Meryn Trant, tortured by Joffrey. So that's great. And guess who shows her any kindness? The Hound. And then Daenerys wakes up after a long slumber and she learns that her baby has died and Khal Drogo is a zombie. And she realizes that Mirri Maz Duur did this on purpose. And so she has her bound and then kills Khal Drogo herself.
Well, and when Mirri Maz Duur explains why she did it, like she makes some solid arguments.
Yeah, definitely.
You kind of see things from her perspective and you really understand why both of them are doing it. And it's really well done in terms of the psychology of those two characters and you being able to like, I can't really argue one over the other. They both have totally valid points.
Yeah. Then we have Tywin basically unleashing the Hound, and then he prepares to depart for Harrenhal whenever he learns that Jaime's been captured. And then he sends Tyrion to the Red Keep to rule.
Which is pretty exciting.
But commands him not to bring Shay. Mysterious ways.
Of course.
We have John deserting the Night's Watch, but then he's found and brought back by his friends. And Mormont knows that this has happened, and he tells them of his, but he doesn't punish him or anything. He tells them of his plan to take a force of the Watch beyond the wall to find Benjen, and John says he's with him. And the show actually shows him setting out on the trip, but the book cuts it there.
It's another thing to get hyped for the next book.
We have Catelyn visiting her father in the book, dying on his balcony before joining a war meeting that's helmed by Robb. She is kind of saying that they should take a peaceful route here, but instead the Bannermen crown him King of the North.
Yeah.
In the show, it removes all the stuff with her father. And also in the show, she doesn't even bother asking for peace. I think she literally agrees with Robb, like, yeah, let's go kill the bastards, basically. Instead, the show also adds a scene where she visits Jaime, who admits to killing Brandock straight up. He's like, yeah, I threw him out that window. That's not in the book, which is kind of crazy at this stage, anyway.
Yeah. It's a great scene.
Then the show has the reveal that Cersei's sleeping with Lancel, also. That's pretty significant, especially a lot later.
Yes.
And then the show also adds a terrible scene with Pycelle and guess who? Roz, that he's been sleeping with. Although it is kind of the reveal that he's like he's more nimble than he, pretends to be.
But it's tragic because there's a deleted scene seasons later that has a reveal that's done so much better. But I think they cut it because they already did that reveal here in such a worse way.
Yeah, with Roz, of course. Everything, like, she does not have a good scene in this show. Well, there's one that you can kind of argue, and it's whenever she's basically leaving the show forever. So,
yeah.
Anyway, we do get a better scene, which is another Littlefinger and Varys kind of discussion. It's not as good as their first one, but they're having another little showdown there in the throne room, one of their little meetings.
Yes.
And then in both mediums, we have Daenerys burning Drogo's corpse and also Mary Messer and entering the fire herself with the eggs, and they hatch. Which is a pretty good ending for both.
Yeah, it's very exciting and impactful.
Okay.
Everyone's like, what the fuck, don't do this.
Yeah.
And then she's like, well, worked out.
Okay, now, so that's everything that's happened. We've covered season 1 in the book and the show. So largely similar, but there's definitely some unnecessary scenes they added and great scenes that they add in the show. So overall, I would say that they are about on par.
Okay.
I think the show, like, it's hard to say with the books because obviously I've not read all the books, so I don't know where this book is going to land for me out of the 5. I definitely think it's better than the second one, which is the only other one that I've read. But I also think season 1 is better than season 2 of the show. But like for this book, I can't really think of a book that I enjoyed more than this one. Like, and you also kind of had for the book you kind of have to give it credit for setting all this up, Like
Sure.
he had to introduce all these characters and does such a good job of introducing them quickly and efficiently, and then also getting you invested in what they're doing and spinning like this great yarn with all what Ned's kind of trying to uncover this conspiracy in King's Landing and all that stuff.
It's brilliant.
I think it's an amazing book.
Every sentence on reread has meaning and purpose, and just the prose is written so beautifully in this one too.
I think it's a masterpiece. Like I've read recently, in recent years, I read all the Witcher books, and then I read all the Harry Potter books as well, reread them. And I think that this even just this first book is probably better than all of those.
And my favorite style of books is where you have different point of view characters, and the way that he's able to embody those in the style of his writing, where
yes,
even if
very
you
strong.
didn't know who he's writing about, you might be able to surmise it just from the style of putting you in the head of an 8-year-old boy or
Sansa, he does a really good job with. Or Catelyn, he does a really good job with. Like it's obviously a much greater undertaking than those books I mentioned, like The Witcher, that actually does do perspective, which Reagan has only really heard the short stories in the beginning of the first actual book, which does have some perspectives, but that obviously nowhere near as many. They have 3 or 4 perspectives they go through, whereas he goes through a lot more than that. And then obviously Harry Potter is really just Harry's perspective, so an easier undertaking.
Well, and as a woman, I think that George does a really great job of writing strong female characters that are complex and nuanced and feel like real people and not just props for the men in the story.
Right.
My major complaint is I could use less descriptions of the breasts of underage characters.
Right. Well, that's part of the reason I think I like the show's decision to age them up.
Sure.
It's not the only reason. I also just think, just me generally, I'm just more interested in older characters, I think.
Sure.
Like it can be done very well with younger characters, but I think I just kind of skew more toward like I'll take a Red Dead Redemption 2 over a I don't know, Legend of Zelda game where your Link is a kid.
Well, and I will say initially the plan was halfway through the series to do a 5-year gap
Hmm.
where everyone is aged up 5 years and you kind of,
But he had the mirror and he's not.
yeah, the mirror
Whatever that
is
means.
not. We'll get there.
Okay. So that's obviously the bulk of the podcast I wanted to go through, but I did come up with a few lists that I wanted to go over. I have my 20, this is really from the show, but I have my 23 top scenes that have taken place so far. Once we finish the whole, we've done them all, I'll have like, I'm going to narrow it down to a top 100 for the whole show. But there are 23 scenes in season one that I would say are contenders. I don't think they'll all make it, obviously, though, because the competition gets a little steeper in later seasons. But
I've not made this list, but I'm sure I'll have
yeah,
things
so
to say
that's fun because you would have the same ones. You might have them in a different order, but like I just wanted to go through like all the big standouts.
Okay.
So 23. This is a scene that really isn't that important in the grand scheme of things, but it's one that we've both gotten a kick out of, which is this tournament is an extravagance we cannot afford.
We quote that all the time.
Yeah,
It's so funny
it's
the way
something
you
that we
said that.
say a lot. And that's like in season 3. You know, not like important, but like it is great in just sort of communicating his disgust for all the pomp and circumstance over there. And it does like reveal some important stuff. It reveals that they're broke.
Mhm.
They're in debt, and it's also the scene where they actually introduce like Renly and Littlefinger and Varys and Pycelle, basically all the small council people.
And
But it's
something,
yeah,
it says something about his character because
yes,
I mean, I don't know, I'd kind of like Attorney about me. Maybe that says something
yeah,
bad about me. Ned's a lord.
yeah.
Uh,
Definitely. It's not like a throwaway scene or anything, but I definitely elevated it a little bit higher just because we get such a kick out of how he says that line.
yeah.
Okay, number 22, I have Your Meat is Bloody Tough, which
Mm.
is when the great John, flies a little too close to the sun with Rob and then gets his finger stripped off by Grey Wind. But I think it's an important scene for Rob kind of establishing his dominance over the Northern Lords for sure.
Earning their respect.
Yeah, but it's also just hilarious, like with his, well, Rob is badass in it. Like he has that line where he's like, doubtless he meant to cut my meat for me, and then like Umber's kind of tries to play it off as funny.
We have that moment of tension
Yeah,
first
yeah.
where you're like, oh my gosh, how is this gonna?
Really great scene.
Yeah.
Number 21 is what I called. So some of these I just had a name. I named this one the Hand's Justice, which is from episode 6. Not a huge scene, but it's a satisfying one where Ned is sitting the throne and he orders justice for the small folk for the horrors that have been unleashed upon them by the mountain.
Yes, and everyone's like, oh, I don't know,
Yeah,
maybe you should wait until Robert gets
except for
back.
Littlefinger, he's like, oh yeah, go for it, man.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, chaos is a ladder.
Right, exactly. Yeah, he's into that. But it's just masterfully written and delivered by Sean Bean, who plays Ned Stark. Like that's really what sells it. Like it's good foreshadowing for Beric Dondarrion as well, but mostly it's just the performance in that scene is very good.
And the small folk are screwed over so much in the series that it's
Yeah, it's
nice
nice
to get someone to care about them. Give them
right.
a
Even
little
that
push.
guy that like brings it before him is shocked that he's gonna do all that for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great scene. Number 20, I have, which you'll know immediately once I say it, The Things I Do for Love. It's
Oh,
Jamie pushing Bran off of the tower. It's obviously a moment that resonates throughout the series,
what a hook.
literally for the rest of the show and books. And then of course it's also the big revelation of Cersei and Jamie's relationship,
Yes.
which is very important. It's
And
also
plants the seeds
right,
for the reveal that the heirs are all bastards.
right. So huge scene. Number 19, I have what I called Tywin and the Stag. So you kind of get where that's going. It's his introduction to the show, which is the original scene where he's kind of berating Jamie, but also kind of providing insight into his philosophy and like a family above all is clearly his kind of mantra. And then he is cleaning this sort of symbolism-filled stag, if you
Yes.
will.
Seen several great YouTube videos breaking down that scene and
Yeah.
just all of the nuances
Because obviously
there.
the stag is the symbol for
House
Robert's
Baratheon.
house. Yeah, Baratheon. And so this is that actor's name is Charles Dance, and he's just being Charles Dance. And I cannot think of anyone that could have done this better. And it's interesting because he really doesn't look very much like Tywin's description in the book, but he's
Yeah.
just so unbelievably good that he can look however he wants. And it's how could you possibly cast anyone else?
Sure.
Number 18 is Love is the Death of Duty, which is just Maester Aemon's conversation with Jon Snow, and he reveals his backstory. It's an amazing scene.
What a good reveal. It's such a beautiful moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good, very well done in both the show and the book. 17, I have what I called the stakes of war, which is kind of a more of an under the radar scene. But this is where Catelyn meets Robb's force on the field. So it's at Moat Cailin in the books, but in the show, it's really just kind of in the field somewhere.
Mhm.
And there's a great juxtaposition here where there's kind of like some comedy where we got Great John Umber telling her that they're gonna like kick Tywin's ass, and then it's off to free Ned, and like there's like some optimism there. But then it turns a lot more serious after they all leave, and it's just Catelyn and Robb. And Catelyn's like, "Look, either you win or we're all dead."
Yeah.
And so I really like the juxtaposition of those two things kind of happening simultaneously.
And I mean, she has a solid read on the situation. Like,
Yeah, she's not wrong. 16, I have the King's deathbed. So this is the kind of shocking and sudden death of Robert Baratheon. But Ned visits him at his deathbed and kind of hears his last wishes, including that Ned rule in his stead until Joffrey comes of age, and that he feels bad about he kind of regrets his decision to assassinate Daenerys on his deathbed too. And so it's a really great end to a flawed and great character. And then the drama is kind of heightened during it while Ned, he doesn't write Joffrey. He says,
it's true heir.
true heir. Yeah, true born heir. Yeah. And so it's like, it's really a lot of stuff is coming up to, because at this point, the truth. Ned knows the truth. Robert's the only one that doesn't know the truth.
And Ned was going to tell him,
He was
then
going to tell him,
can't
but
bring
he's
himself
dead.
to at his deathbed.
And so he's just like, it's like really heightening the tension and like you're getting ready for this, like, wow, what's going to happen? The king's dead. Now what?
And I'll be honest, I cried the last time I watched the scene with Brandon.
Right.
And I was so surprised because, I'm not like Robert, I'm very aware of all his flaws. I think that he's not a great person. He
No, but
certainly
a great
wasn't a great
character.
king. But yeah, just when he changes his mind about Dany and just
He
his
says,
only
"You're
brother
right."
in his
Yeah.
deathbed with his brother, like
Yeah,
right
Renly's
here.
there. Yeah.
Oh, well, I meant Ned. I
Oh,
think
like
you mean
his
Ned is more of a brother
yeah,
than
like
Renly
his
is
his
Stannis.
real brother. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. It's just very well done.
Yeah, very great scene. 15, I have golden haired. So it's basically the scene where Sansa of all people helps Ned kind of connect the dots that he's been lining up for weeks at that point. Joffrey is in fact not Robert's son, and obviously one of the most important revelations of the show. And especially for those who hadn't figured it out by then, I think most people probably have connected the dots by then. But I like how the show gives you time to try to connect the dots yourself. I definitely remember experiencing that and like thinking about what he was investigating.
Sure. Well, it's kind of the murder mystery
Yeah,
of and it's not the reveal of who committed this murder, but it's a reveal of
Yeah, right.
motive.
Yeah. And it's a very memorable scene. Like, I mean, Brandon still talks about it, like him going through that book. And he's like, black a hair, and then golden head. And he like really has to like even like looks up, like, shock. He definitely plays up. It's almost like a scene from a play or something.
Yeah.
But it is a memorable scene, I think, because of those little touches.
Yeah. Everything clicks.
14, I have No One Touches Sam, which is another
Aw.
great added sequence to the show where Rast is kind of like John says, no one touches Sam, and then Rast is like, well, I'm going to touch him all I want. I think he says he's going to slice off some bacon or something like that. And John doesn't say anything in that moment, but then he gags him in the night and says, no one touches Sam. And with Ghost.
My only complaint about that scene is Ghost is growling, and it's just one of the instances where Ghost is making sound where he shouldn't.
Yeah, that is cool
silent.
that he is silent, but I think it works. 13, I have what I just called the parenting dichotomy. So it's really kind of a combination of two scenes, but they're right next to each other. Where there's this parallel painted between Cersei, who's telling Joffrey everyone else is an enemy, to Ned, who is dealing with two very upset daughters, because this is after the big sequence in episode 2 where Lady's killed and Mike is killed, and they're both very mad. And it's also before Arya has like started, like she develops her passion for training with Syria, but she doesn't even have that at this point, so she's just very upset. And he's clearly like upset himself and stressed with his new position. We've already found out about the tournament and the realm is broke and all this stuff, but he still finds the time to like have like this quiet one-on-one chat with Arya, and he's kind of honest with her about the dangers of the capital and the realities of the position in it. And then like he finds out about the sword, and he still lets her, even though it's not something that he would have expected her to be interested in or something that is acceptable for girls really to be interested in, he lets her keep training with the sword. When later we know that he gets Syria, but we don't know that in this scene. But like he says, well, just keep it, And so it's just really, it's just the fact that that happens back to back with the Cersei theme that I like so much.
Yeah. I knew exactly what you were going to say when you said the parenting dichotomy. And it's really interesting. And that as a father is interesting, especially when he goes off to King's Landing with the girls, which are not who he would traditionally be parenting. Traditionally,
Right.
he would be raising the young lords, and Catelyn would be responsible and really Septim Mordane would be responsible for making Sansa and Arya into young ladies. And I do think that he's a much better father to Arya than he is to Sansa. And Arya is more interested in masculine things, and so he might be a little bit more comfortable with that. And maybe that's a little bit why he's more accepting of those things, because it makes him it's easier for him to connect and parent in that way.
Okay. Number 12, I have Varys versus Littlefinger Part 1. So I actually didn't put their second little conversation on my list, but the first one is like the first one, so it's really great. And they also, it's just a better scene, I think, because they both are kind of revealing their hands a little bit because like they're kind of one-upping each other about how much they know, and like how they're spying on each other. But they know that it's useless because they're not going to reveal what they actually are going to do with that information, So it's just like, it doesn't really matter. And so they kind of having this little back and forth with it.
It's awesome. It's all politics and intrigue and just
and
so gripping.
And also the audience does not know what their goals are either with all that knowledge.
Yes.
So, really great. And of course, it doesn't hurt that they're two of the best written and acted and entertaining characters in the show.
Especially at this point.
Yeah. Number 11, I have War Stories. So this is in a show exclusive scene. It's the one between Jaime and Robert and Barristan Selmy discussing their first kills. And then also Robert kind of makes Jaime talk about killing Aerys Targaryen too. And so that's like the first indication that he was, I guess, I don't know if we'd heard him called the Mad King at that point or not. I don't think so. I think this is kind of the reveal that he was crazy, where he's like, says that he was saying burn them all and stuff.
Yeah.
So it paints a dark picture of warfare, which is good. And then it also kind of gives you some insight into what it does psychologically to the survivors, which are all three of these guys are. And then of course I mentioned already that it shows Jaime acting with some deference to someone for the first time, which is not the king, but Barristan Selmy, who he respects.
Yeah, that's all awesome. My only caveat would be that it might undercut a little bit when Jaime reveals later the burn it all and his motivations for killing them.
Oh, you mean like in season 3?
Yes.
Well, that one you get like a much clearer picture of what like everything that happened.
Yes.
This one we just kind of know like the king was kind of nuts, but we don't know what he was telling. Like he was saying burn them all, I guess, but we don't know the depth of what he was trying to get Jaime to do.
Sure.
So number 10, so top 10 now. Number 10, we have the King of the North. So I do think this is for sure the best scene in the finale episode, which is in the wake of Ned's death, the Northern Lords, led by Great John Umber, declare Robb Stark as the King in the North, and the Winterfell music is blaring in the background.
Yes.
And it is awesome.
Yeah, I gotta cheer along if you rewatch it.
Yeah.
It's fun. I mean, on one hand, I'm kind of with Book Catelyn. Like, I'd rather them just make peace and get the daughters back and avoid all the heartache that comes with war.
Yeah,
but on the other hand, Northern Independence King of the North.
Yeah. Okay, number 9, I have Snow's Farewell. So it's basically a combination, but the right one after another, where Jon Snow is basically saying the same thing to all the characters. He's like saying goodbye to everybody. The one with him and Arya, where he gives her needle, is like the best one, I would say.
Yes.
Basically the climax of that relationship. And they never interacted. Well, oh no, they do. It's just Jon and Ned who never interact again after this, where he says he'll tell him about his mother next time they meet. So definitely enhanced, I would say, in hindsight, these scenes. Like when you're watching them the first time, you don't really understand how important they are. But in hindsight,
you get curious.
Yeah, like, they still hit hard.
You
understand that these people grew up together and now they're going their separate ways. But when you watch it again after seeing the whole show, it's like, wow, really great stuff.
And I will say, one of the things I remember distinctly about watching the show the first time was just wanting the Starks to reunite so much. Right. That was my number one desire with the show, was Stark reunions. And so this being a Stark goodbye
Mhm.
really kind of cemented that desire.
Yeah, very good. Number 8, I have the Lannister coup, which is, of course, the dramatic sequence where Ned Stark enters the throne room with Joffrey seated on it, and he thinks he's got everything lined up to take the Lannisters into custody and take the throne for himself, until Stannis can arrive to claim it, of course, but only for his men to get completely, literally stabbed in the back by the city guard at the order of Littlefinger, and so we kind of realize how deep he is at this
Mhm.
point. So great scene, obviously. Number 7, I have the meeting of the mothers, which is that added scene where Cersei visits Catelyn as she sits at Bran's bedside and shares the story of the death of her first son. And it leaves the viewer, I think, unsure of what to feel or what's real, even because we know, obviously, as the viewer, that Cersei is the reason Bran is in his predicament, but we don't know whether what she's saying is true or how much of that she actually feels. And so, because of that, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, and the meeting of this, well, in the emotionally intimate way of these two flawed mother figures that are complex and deeply in the shit with politics and
Yes.
have their own motivations, and just seeing them connect in this way, I think it's a good addition, and I do appreciate the added depth in Cersei's character.
Yes. Number 6 is another good addition. So they're doing quite well with these additional scenes because they're really getting some good stuff here in my top 10, at least for me. This is another added scene, which is holding the realm together, which is just this lengthy, again, psychologically rich scene that's exclusive to the show between Robert and Cersei that starts off humorous. They're kind of laughing about how much their marriage is a sham,
Yeah.
and being the only thing holding the realm together. And then it takes a serious turn where they're kind of acknowledging the futility of their marriage before it even began due to Robert's, obsession with Lyanna Stark, which still exists, still persists, even though he doesn't even remember what she looked like.
Yeah, it's brilliant. All of those dynamics that we
Right.
talked about earlier. Just eat them right up.
Number 5, I have Letter from a Sister, which is just really great in the show in particular. Really great use of cinematography here, where they get the letter. There's, we know that they want Ned to go, and the last hand now was killed instead of just died. But that's a lot more alarming.
The letter from Liza Aaron
Yeah,
about
that John Aaron's been killed by the Lannisters, she says. And so then it has a scene where Ned actually faces the camera and he's thinking about this, and then they literally position Catelyn and Maester Luwin on his shoulders.
I'm a sucker for that. A devil and an
Uh-huh.
angel on your shoulder.
And they counsel him on what he should do based on this information. This is an amazing thing. Number 4, I have Ned versus Jaime. So obviously the epic showdown between these two at the conclusion of episode 5, which is the midpoint of the season, obviously had been building from the beginning of the show. They clearly had very palpable disdain for each other. But while Jaime and his men just kill Ned's men without even sparing them the thought, Jaime clearly wants to test himself against Ned.
Yes.
And then he's disgusted when one of his men steals kind of the purity of his potential victory with a sneak attack to Ned's leg. So obviously an amazing way to end that episode. But it's just Ned lying in the street and Jaime riding off, which is not unlike the trajectory of the show for much of it. But yeah, really, obviously a very climactic confrontation there. Number 3, so we're very high praise everything at this point. I don't think a lot of people would probably put this one above something epic like Ned versus Jaime, but I called it A Meal on the Road, which is this scene between Robert and Ned in episode 2, where they're kind of talking about their glory days before the motherhood of Jon Snow. They're talking about Bessie and her big tits and all that, and Ned, they're kind of having a laugh about that, and then but then he asks Ned who John's mother is, and he says something. He says Wyla, whatever. But the acting is so good from Sean Bean, even though he doesn't know what the answer actually is. But the way that he pulled it off to where it seems like he does.
Yeah.
Is I just love that so much, and a part of that is because this is the payoff for this is my favorite episode of the show, so obviously that elevates this scene for me. But man, every time I watch that scene where they're just having their little meal together in the countryside, I just love that.
Well, and no one else Ned will indulge with an answer.
Mm-hmm.
But Robert obviously is the king. He kind of has to say something. But he still is very just his reaction
Right. And then just the
question.
implications of that also, we don't have to spoil it, but he specifically does not want Robert to know the answer to that question. And so, like, maybe that's part of the reason that he has to can't give him an answer. But like, just that, like, in the way that Sean acts it out, like, I don't know if they even told him like you really don't want Robert to know, or what they told him, but like it really, the scene really takes a turn because they're laughing before that, and then he says, "And what about you, your bastard's mother?" And he's like, he like really like shuts him down immediately. It's just really well acted.
Yes.
Okay, so then we have the top two. These are definitely well, number two, I almost even put above number one, and it's not the scene. Like number one is what you're going to expect, but number two is what I call Lannister justice. So it's just that incredible and brutal sequence where Ned finds Robert and Cersei questioning Arya after the incident with Nymeria and Joffrey, and Cersei convinces Robert to have the direwolves, including Lady, who is innocent of any wrongdoing, killed. And then Ned's like, "Well, if it's got to be that way, I'll do it myself." And then, so we're already discussed at that point. And then he walks outside, and we see the Hound hauling Mike in, and it's like this is really great. Like we said earlier, just this oh shit moment for the viewer, but also for Ned, who is just like realizing the depravity of the people that he's with, the
Yeah.
Lannisters in particular, and the fact that Robert is not stepping in to do anything about all this.
Also, the last thing we saw on our first date before we fell
Yes,
asleep.
that's true. So maybe that boosted in some way for me, but I think I just really think that's just a really great, really strong scene. And then like
I hooked him.
to end it with him killing the wolf, and it's like it's been proven, I think, that people react more to the killing of animals in media than people.
Sure.
And I definitely we definitely feel worse about the dog than the kid.
Well, she's such a good
Yeah,
girl, and she
yeah.
didn't even do anything. She was the best behaved. And you get frustrated with Joffrey, you get frustrated with Cersei. Really, I mean, Sansa is in a pickle there. Like
Mhm.
Ned defends her choice later to
Right,
stand
it's
by
the
her
Arya.
fiance,
Yeah.
but it is tough to watch because she pays for it,
Yeah.
and
Immediately.
You're frustrated with Robert because
Because he could step in.
but he doesn't. He rolls over, and Ned says something about like Robert.
He says, "Is this your command?" Or something like that. Yeah.
But well, Cersei says something about like the Robert I married would have brought me a wolf
Oh,
pelt,
sure,
and
sure, sure.
um, I think the Robert that Ned knew would not have rolled over to
Right,
Cersei.
right. It's just like you're so disgusted by this sequence, and the fact that it happens this early in just episode two, and you're like, well, how can it get any worse than this? And it's just, that's chump change compared to what happens later on in the show, including my number one, which is of course Ned getting killed. But like I just love that number two scene a lot. Yeah, I debated it. Like I went back and really analyzed that scene where Ned's killed. I was like, am I really gonna put this number one? Because this is what everybody would expect to be number one from season one. And the way that they really heighten the tension there with like him confessing, and you're like already kind of disappointed by that decision by him, but you're like, oh, I guess maybe it's for the best. And like they're like, well, maybe I'll just send to the wall, and at least we'll get Ned with John, and that'll probably be entertaining and stuff. And yeah, I remember watching this for the first time and thinking like I really did not think this was going to be it for him, because he is the main character of the show at this point. I figured of course I knew he would die at some point in this show, but for him to die this early was shocking.
It's twisted because he's your favorite. I was so excited to watch you react to this.
Mhm.
And the way that his last act in the show is to get Yoren to make Arya
Oh yeah,
stop and look away is just beautiful. And he did it for Sansa, like to protect the girls, but how much would have been different if he
just what said the
hadn't
truth. Yeah,
confessed because he was killed anyway. And then for Joffrey to say, like, I did have mercy, that
right.
he
That's
had a
later
clean
on,
death.
but
But that, like, I mean, I guess rewatching it,
right.
that just the injustice of it all
Hmm.
is
Yeah. So
beautifully done.
that's the one that everyone thinks is the best scene from the show, or for season one, and I think they're probably right. It is definitely the most important. Okay, and then I also have the ranking of just the 10 episodes. So my clearly at the bottom of my list is episode 4, which is Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things. So this is the first episode of the show that I think is fundamentally worse than this sequence in the books. It loses some of the great scenes like Rob and Bran's little cry session that we talked about earlier, and then Sansa's interactions with Joffrey and the Hound. And then instead we get some of the worst scenes of the show, like Sansa talking with the Septa, and then where she's just being a jerk, and then just like that truly awful scene with Viserys and the handmaiden in the bath talking about the dragons. And then even just beyond all that, it doesn't really have any standout moment other than, I guess, John's defense of Sam. I think that might be where he does the ghost moment. And then Ned, it is where Ned discovers Gendry. So that's it didn't make my list of the best moments, but that's like a good reveal.
Yeah.
So but without those, I think this would have veered even further down. I would say this is like C tier at best, but I consider D tier,
Wow.
which is like I think this is probably one of the worst episodes of the show. Okay, number 9, I have A Golden Crown, actually.
Interesting.
So this is episode 6. Definitely a noticeable step down from the highs of episode 5, because that's like the one that culminates with Ned versus Jaime in the streets. It's still important because this is where Ned gets the revelation of Joffrey's heritage. And it also has the death of Viserys, obviously. But while both of those are important, I don't think they're like among this show's best scenes by any means.
I do think that the Golden Crown is clever because he feels so immune.
Yeah, it's clever, but I don't know. He really doesn't do much for me. To me, and I think this is a problem that I have with a lot of Daenerys' stuff, is we have like the plot really moving forward, and there's a lot of like really interesting things going on with everybody else. And then with Daenerys, it kind of feels like the show and I guess the books kind of set up like these little side bosses for her to take down, and then like she takes him down, and it's like you're supposed to be like, well, that was satisfying, and I'm just like, yeah, whatever. That's what I expected to happen, and it happened. And I don't know. I think she's obviously, I have my critiques with her storyline. I think she's a little dull until it's like the whole time you're just waiting for her to go over to the West. And I know that that's not happening here. And I like this more than some of the other stuff that happens later. Obviously, with Viserys is more important, but I just don't. I think at the end of the day, I just don't think he's a very compelling character. I don't really think there's much nuance to him. I know that you're explaining. You said earlier, like some of the stuff that you think is present in his character, and I'm not saying that it's not. I just don't think that I just don't think he's a compelling character. He's just like a annoying little shit that gets what's coming to him, and then we move on.
Compelled by his moments of vulnerability in a similar way to Joffrey. Obviously, he doesn't
He's
hold
just
a candle.
well, Joffrey's
Joffrey.
entertaining. Name a scene where Viserys is entertaining.
Well, I mean, he certainly, like when he's terrible, he grips me, and I guess that's entertaining. Like
I see he doesn't really for me because we get so much more
enraged.
depraved characters later on.
And then when he says like right before he dies, and he's like, "That's all I wanted." It was just like, what was I promised? Like, and he's like really vulnerable there, and it does make me feel something.
Well,
And
it
with
doesn't for
Daenerys,
me.
For me, it's less about what's happening with her plot and more in season 1, her inner journey of finding empowerment and going from absolutely no autonomy to having complete control for what she does and finding power symbolically. I don't know. I don't like her character as much as some of the others, but I think the first time I watched season 1, she might have been my favorite.
Wow. Well, that's obviously what they want you to feel, but it just didn't quite work on me as well as it did with a lot of the other characters. But anyway, also in this episode, we have the debut of Osha, who I also don't really care much for, and then Tyrion's trial by combat, and then kind of the beginning of his relationship with Bronn, which is obviously pretty entertaining. But I would still, I still put it in the B tier, but it would definitely be very low. Number 8, I have The Pointy End. This is episode 8. This is kind of. It doesn't have quite the high point of A Golden Crown, which I think is probably that, Ned's sitting down with the book and coming up with the truth. But I do think it's more consistent than A Golden Crown because we have more great scenes with Rob and just kind of the general fallout of Ned's imprisonment, all of which is pretty good stuff.
Sure.
Nothing super stand out in that episode either, but definitely I think better than the last one. My number 7, I have the finale, episode 10, Fire and Blood.
Interesting.
Definitely a noticeable step down from the highs of episode 9, which is obviously where they really go all out for the most part, until season 6. But I feared that um, Fire and Blood, I might actually make it through this whole episode without a single great scene. But then we do have Rob crowning as the King of the North, so that's pretty awesome. That's a clear standout.
Yeah.
And then we do have Catelyn's kind of rendezvous with Jamie right after that, which is also, it's not as much of a standout, but it's definitely interesting because he just fesses up to what he did, and kind of the not really dichotomy, but just like the conflict between Catelyn and Jamie is interesting.
Mhm.
And then we also get the strengthening of John's devotion to the Night's Watch. I think because this is like at the end where they're getting ready to march off, and before that, I guess he does his desertion thing, and then he comes back, all that stuff. And then obviously the big end of Daenerys's Khal Drogo storyline with the birth of the dragons. That's a moment that didn't make my top list, but obviously a significant moment.
Sure.
Number 6, I have Lord Snow, which is episode 3. In some ways I thought that the nuances and standout scenes of this episode were better than the first one, which obviously we haven't gotten to yet. But I gave that one the credit for doing such a good job of introducing all the characters and story threads. So this one is the one that ends with Arya starting her sword training, and then the show. This was maybe the most egregious one, where the showrunners try to make it ultra dramatic by superimposing the sounds of the clashing of wood with the clashing of steel. And Ned's watching on, kind of questioning what he's done. I think that felt a bit ham-fisted to me, and I thought that was one of the weaker episode endings. But it's
Interesting. Because it's clearly him like having a little bit of PTSD and picturing the horrors of battle and what Arya training actually means for her.
Yeah, I get it. All that I understood. I still just
a little heavy-handed for you.
Just for that to be like the big cliffhanger end.
Well, it's definitely not a cliffhanger.
Well, okay, whatever. The dramatic end to the episode. But still a solid episode. So I have that at number 6. Number 5, I have Winter is Coming, which is the first episode. Sets the stage for the series. More fun to watch in hindsight than it probably is the first time, because you get to see all the Starks together for those precious few moments before the Lannisters show up. And then
the end of that episode, though, the first time.
Yeah, that's good too. It does a good job of introducing each of the characters without too much exposition, and then adding some intrigue with the letter implicating the Lannisters in the death of Jon Arryn, and then of course the cliffhanger with Jaime pushing him out the window.
Which just the way that they build to that moment, and then everything kind of comes together. I don't know. It's really
So top half,
so impactful.
Top half for me of the season. Number 4, I have episode 107. So episode 7, which is You Win or You Die. So a hugely consequential episode that really slows down the book's pacing. This one that only had 3 chapters included in it, to really hammer home some of the big sequences with Robert's death and then the Lannister coup to take the throne out from under Ned. And then it also is the beginning of the Tywin Lannister character with that great scene we talked about with the stag. And it even has the assassination attempt on Daenerys. So this was like this episode is like a lot of important stuff going on at once. So definitely one of the stronger ones from this season. Number 3, I have episode 5, which is The Wolf and the Lion, which has a lot of standout moments, many of which are original to the show. We have Varys' first confrontation with Littlefinger. We have the scene with Robert and Cersei we talked about, and then of course Ned's big showdown with Jaime in the streets. So you got to give. I think I mentioned that the previous episode, I think it was 4. I was like, it's a clear win for the book, and that part. I think this is a clear win for the show, for these 3 chapters that it takes over. Just because it adds some important scenes, and then the scenes that it does have, like Jaime versus Ned, I think are done better in the show. Number 2, I have episode 2, which is The King's Road. I think this was all the other ones I would have said, like the last one I would have said is like C tier. I think the rest of them were like B tier. This is for like Game of Thrones standards. This one I think is like an actual like standout, really strong episode of the show, of like the whole counting everything all the way to the end, where it's just like the first episode you think about it being like a really strong introduction to the series, but I think episode 2 it like doubles the number of standout scenes from the first episode. It has all the farewell scenes with the Starks. It has Cersei's meeting with Catelyn. It has Ned and Robert's meal on the road that I love so much. It has the culmination of the Joffrey Nymeria incident, and all that stuff. Just hard hitting episode from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So I really love that one. But number one, I did give to Baelor, which is episode 9, the one where they always go all out, and it's the death of Ned. Obviously, kind of almost had to ensure that this episode was going to be at least in the top 2.
Sure.
And I considered putting it below episode 2, which I do think has more standout sequences. But obviously, Ned's death is like one of the most, not even just in Game of Thrones, it's like one of the most infamous scenes in television history at this point. And so I think the boldness of that storytelling as well, of him having set up all these other characters, but Ned clearly being the lead, to have faith that these other characters that he set up at this point is going to be enough to carry things forward. And then now they also have to deal with the death of the main character is awesome. Like, great storytelling.
And I mean, the follow through is brilliant, the way that they actually deal with those consequences.
Yes.
And Ned echoes throughout the rest of the series.
Yes.
He's not just forgotten about.
Hugely. He's extremely important for the rest of the series, even though he's not there. And then, but put me over the edge, put this one at number 1, is it's not just that one trick pony either. Because it also, the thing that I don't like, my least favorite part of the episode is all the Shay stuff. It's the introduction to Shay, which is an important character. I understand that. But I just think it's a little long where they're having their little drinking game in the tent and all that. But outside of that, this gives us Rob's first big victory in battle, right? That's huge.
Sure.
He captures Jaime. We have the fall of Khal Drogo in this episode. We have the introduction of Walder Frey in this episode.
Oh, that's
and then
fun.
also the reveal of Maester Aemon's Targaryen heritage in this episode. So with all that put together, I was like, it's got to be episode 9.
Yeah.
So
solid argument.
That's my ranking of the season so far, or of the episodes in season 1. Eventually, I'm going to add all the other episodes and make one big long list. Probably I'll reveal that at the end. I think what I'll do is I'll just do them one season at a time going forward, but then at the end I'll reveal them all. That'll be like a separate episode because that would be super long for to include in all at once. So we're almost done here, but I did want to rank just like the standout chapters from the book. There aren't as many as there were scenes from the show, but there were 9 basically chapters of the book that I thought like really stood out to me as being very strong. One of the number 9 is chapter 30. You got to understand that the chapters aren't named; they're just the point of view character.
Sure, you do like Arya 3, Sansa 5.
So I don't even do that. I just came up with names. So number 9, I titled "A Visit from Varys." So this is from Ned. This is where he speaks with Robert as he's getting ready for the melee, and then he watches the finals with Sansa, and that's when the Hound kills what's that guy's name? The Squire.
Yeah.
The Squire of Jon Arryn.
Sir Hugh?
Yeah, Sir Hugh, yeah. But the reason this is up there is just because it's got that scene where Varys visits Ned, and this is kind of his like big thing where Ned kind of finds out how deep the hole goes here, where there's like so much going on, where he basically confirms his fears that Jon Arryn was poisoned and that the Lannisters are going to move against Robert, and he then basically confirms that Sir Hugh was the one that poisoned him, and then they had the Mountain kill him to cover it up, and then he's like asking him, why did Jon Arryn have to go, all that stuff. It's basically that scene with Varys that puts it, I think, at this point.
Which Ned is not cut out for this.
No, definitely
this is not his cup of tea, but he pushes through.
It's a scene that goes by so fast in the show with him and Varys that I actually forgot it was there. When I read this in the book, I was like, oh my God, this scene is so important. I can't believe it wasn't in the show. And then, of course, when I went back, I realized that it was. But I think in book form, it's critical for Ned as he kind of starts to, like at the beginning, he's feeling better about his position with Robert. And then, by the end, he's just like has more questions than ever. And he's very concerned about his safety in the position that he's in. So really great stuff. Number 8, I have chapter 35, which is another Ned chapter. This is the one where he's going up against Jaime. So we obviously talked about what happens here. I like I said, I do think the show kind of does this scene a little bit better. I like the change of the guy spearing his knee instead of the horse falling on him. But either way, the stakes are very high, and the book definitely does a better job of getting you attached to the other men that are killed.
Yes.
Specifically Jory and Will, who are killed as part of this attack. And then I do think that maybe the book's nighttime setting sort of elevates the intensity of it.
Yeah, I can see why the show would want to do it in the day.
Yeah, because you want to be able to see everything.
You can see Jaime's golden armor glinting and...
Okay, so number 7, I had chapter 62, which is Tyrion's, I think, last chapter, which I called The Feint. This is where he takes part in the battle against Robb's army, but then they realize that, no, the guys that they took out really was not the main force.
Interesting.
And it's basically the first battle scene of the series that plays out much differently in the book. Obviously, since Tyrion gets immediately knocked out on the show. I like the big turn at the end in the book versus the show where Tywin is just like gloating about his victory, and then like
Yeah.
it's like immediately turns to fury when he realizes that it was just a trick, and that now his son that he actually cares about is in danger. So chapter 66, this is a very interesting pick for me. This is a Bran chapter, might never happen again, and it's called A Trip to the Crypt. So this is where they go down into the crypt, and like we kind of talked about earlier, it's really not in the show where they've had the dreams. Him and Rickon have had the dreams about Ned's death, and
Are you sure that's not in the show?
it's in the show. They do go down into the crypt, but it's just like it goes by so much faster in the show. You don't
Yes.
really get the fallout from the conversation. Like and the book, it continues where they go back up after. Well, first the Maester is attacked by Shaggy Dog. He's like pissed off about that.
Yeah.
And then like they go up and he has like a chat with Bran while he's getting patched up, and then the Raven actually comes with the news.
Yes.
So I do think it's much better done in the book. But there's I like it as like kind of a standout little side quest in a way, as this little adventure down into this crypt, and I think it's pretty important long term for establishing just the setting of the crypt
Which
as
is
as a great hiding place.
sure, and also just really, I think, going to be important throughout the series, even in upcoming books. It's a touchstone for the Starks.
Yeah, and then I also think it's a clear high point for this Bran storyline because it does a good job of actually giving some depth and characterization to minor characters like Rickon and Osha that I think are kind of lacking in the show. And then of course any extra time spent with Maester Luwin is time well spent.
Agreed.
So number 5, I have Love is the Death of Duty, Jon Snow chapter, basically, where we get the reveal of Maester Aemon's heritage.
Yeah.
That's basically what it comes down to. Just that conversation with Aemon and Snow here, where he reveals his Targaryen heritage to him. I think that alone just kind of puts this chapter in the upper echelon of the series up to that point.
Especially on reread, that one is just so rich and
Yeah.
just beautifully done.
4, I named Dance of the Devil, which is the Daenerys chapter where Khal Drogo collapses on his ride and Daenerys takes him into his tent, and they start the blood magic, and then they kind of have the revolt outside. It's really
any fan.
Yeah, it's really that scene. Well, I just think this scene is so much stronger in the book because you actually care or know who these guys are that are in the revolt. Like you have an idea of who those Dothraki guys are. Whereas in the show, it's really just, okay, there's these brown guys that have been going around with her, and Jorah's going to kill a couple of them, and then she kind of sorts out this. It goes like really fast in the show. So I like it better that they have a little more time to breathe with it in the book. And they actually, there's like the one that almost kills her is one that she's actually been comfortable with in the past, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
Like that's a turn. But you don't get any of that book, or in the show. So I think I was kind of elevating it here just because I think it was so much better done in the book. Number 3, I have Dead Man Walking with Jon Snow. So this is actually with the White encounter.
Okay.
Which doesn't stand out to me in the book at all, or in the show at all. But something about reading it really kind of gets you into Jon's psyche, because obviously he's in trouble when this chapter starts with Alistair and everything. And I think that just kind of makes it a more powerful sequence, which I think, again, in the show comes and goes pretty fast. And it's, it's a huge inciting moment for the Night's Watch in terms of it's what kind of makes Mormont want to go north of the wall and really kind of get a grasp on what's really going on out there. And then obviously elevating the relationship between Jon and Mormont. And it has Ghost being badass.
I mean, can't get enough of that.
There you go. Number 2, I actually have chapter 6, which is Letter from a Sister with Catelyn.
Oh.
So yeah, basically the call to action for the story that really starts setting the plot in motion, which is extended by Bran's fall 2 chapters later. I really like the scene where Ned, like before the letter comes, where Ned and Catelyn are just like comfortable in their home before everything starts going to shit really fast, and kind of getting into the head of Catelyn, who is surprisingly insistent that Ned go to King's Landing, unlike in the show, and I think that's really interesting. She also gives the classic line of "Her loins are aching from the fury of Ned's lovemaking," or something like that, which is hilarious.
not his most iconic line about lovemaking. We haven't gotten there yet, but
Oh, okay.
it's
It stuck out to
it's a
me.
good one.
I'll stick out to me. I'll tell you that. That's my number two, but my number one actually is a Sansa chapter, which I called The Mourning Daughter. This is whenever she's mourning about Ned's imprisonment. And we kind of get the reveal that she was actually the one that kind of unwittingly set it in motion. And
Jane Poole.
yeah, it has this stuff with Jane Poole. So it's really, so while Ned's kind of come to Jesus meeting, I guess, is that one where we have the death of Lady and Micah. This is kind of Sansa's, I think, where she realizes, oh, this is a bad situation. She's like kind of in deep with no cover, if you will.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, and the main chapter, I think, that kind of deals with the fallout of Ned's arrest, because by the time this chapter's over, like you get some stuff with Rob, I guess, but like this is kind of the one where it kind of happens immediately after that, so it's like really kind of hammers home the significance of what has happened there. And also you get some insight into the Lannisters, which is rare for the books, where they're kind of scrambling to figure out what to do.
Yes.
Like they've got Sansa locked up for 3 days. They're scheming that whole time, you know. So that's really cool.
And hearing about her telling Cersei and kind of Cersei's manipulation there is.
And Sansa's chapters in general, like I talked about, they stand out to me in the first book because her character is just so different from how it's portrayed in the show. And also, they don't overuse her in the book. She has very few chapters, and so they are significant to me when they happen.
I think that she's one of the most consistently excellent point of view characters in the books throughout the whole series.
Okay, and so the last couple lists I have ranking the dead characters, which I have 7 that I deemed significant enough to rank.
Okay.
And then I have ranking the point of view characters from the book. So the ranking the dead characters is actually taking both into consideration. I'm taking both the show and the books into consideration.
Interesting.
So that means that there's more characters here, because like with the show, I would not have 7 that I would elevate to this status.
Okay.
But with the book, I have 7. In both cases, we have Viserys Targaryen, who I have at the bottom. I would say he is a D tier character. So obviously there to serve a purpose, but I think he's just too cartoonishly evil that it doesn't really hammer home with me at any point. I'm kind of glad that he's dead early. 6, I actually have Garrod, which is the guy that Ned's chops off his head at the beginning of the book. We don't spend a ton of time with him, of course, but I do like that he's used as the point of view for the Night's Watch deserter in the book instead of the green kid that we kind of talked about at the beginning. It gives his desertion and the report of the Whites more weight. And then it's kind of cool where it's like this character that you just invested however many pages into, and then he just immediately gets his head chopped off by the actual main character.
He's not the point of view. Will is the point of view in the prologue, right?
Oh, you're right. But the fact that like this sequence that you just invested time into, and then like you get to the actual main characters, and they're just like, yeah, whatever, chop his head off and get on with our day, which I think is great. 5, I have Jory, which is obviously Ned's right-hand man. There's not a ton to latch onto with him even in the book, but I do like him as Ned's kind of truest companion in King's Landing, and his death hits a little bit harder in the book than it does in the show.
He also goes to show how much Ned inspires loyalty with his style of leadership in comparison to how the Lannisters lead, or even how Robert leads.
Yeah. These are all D tier characters, not like amazing or anything. There's not really been that many significant deaths yet, but I thought they were list worthy. 4, I have actually, this is kind of my craziest pick maybe, which is Kaholo. Which is a Dothraki. It's a sleeper pick, but I think that he's the most interesting of the Dothraki that are killed after the fall of Drogo, because unlike some of the others, he's always nice to Daenerys, but ironically is the one that almost kills her. And she's only saved because of Jorah's intervention.
Yeah, he's very driven by, the ways of his culture, and, Khal Drogo fell off his horse.
Right.
That's an interesting pick.
3, I have the first character that I would say is stronger in the show than the book, and that is Khal Drogo himself.
Okay.
I think that he works better in the show because you get to see not only him in like his reactions to things, but also like his prowess in battle. And then obviously that guy that plays him really is like a very charismatic actor that obviously went on to much greater fame after this. And I just don't know that you get all of that from the book. I think I would even go so far as to say significantly worse than the book.
Wow.
Like in the book, he really doesn't have anything redeeming about him. Whereas in the show, you kind of, just through the strength of that actor's performance, you kind of feel for him in some ways. It's sad when he dies in the show.
Sure. I feel like they almost overcompensate a little bit where he's romanticized a little bit too much.
Yeah.
But
he is badass, like in that fight scene, and like the scene where he's like really fired up about that guy trying to kill Daenerys, and he like talks about how he's gonna go across the ocean and everything, and you're like, yeah, you do that, man. And then like he's like, I'm gonna rape all the women, and he's like,
You're
oh,
like,
okay,
oh.
well, maybe we've gone a little far there, but
That's almost like a speed run of Breaking Bad, where it's like, okay, at what point,
yeah,
where's the line?
right,
At
right.
what point are you gonna back off?
So because of like those little scenes, I still don't think he's like an amazing Game of Thrones character, but I do think he's stronger in the show than in the book.
Okay.
And then number two, I have Syrio. So
Cool.
technically we never see him die, but obviously we know he never returns. I think it's safe to say he bit the dust. Not a particularly deep character, but certainly a delight anytime that he's on screen or in the page.
Absolutely.
And then number one, I have Ned Stark, who is an S tier character in the show, and I would say maybe an A tier character in the book.
Ooh.
Because like in the show, he was my favorite character until it took me multiple seasons to where I was like, okay, maybe I like Jon Snow better.
Yes.
Whereas like Ned, I just think that Sean Bean's performance is so unbelievably strong. There's stuff that he acts so well, you question what he knows.
Mm-hmm.
Where like in the book, it's still he's obviously still a great character, but I think it's really just that performance that elevates him. I don't know if Ned would be my number two or three or whatever he is Game of Thrones character from the book, but from the show, he's on that level.
I think that's fair. You do get some stuff in the book that you don't in the show, like insight into his relationship with his sister and um a little bit
Yeah,
more.
which is important. Yeah, there's definitely important story stuff that happens in the book that we don't get, but the character himself, then we get that stuff later on too.
Sure.
Like his sister. So, yeah, so he's obviously the number one character that's been killed at this point, but I do like him more in the show. Okay, and then last thing here is just ranking the 9 point of view characters for book one. Number 9, we have Will.
Oh, well.
Because technically he does serve as a point of view character, even though it's only for the introduction. But it's cool to have the like I kind of what I talked about, where it's like this very dramatic sequence in the book, and then just means absolutely nothing to the actual main characters after it's over. And I think it works better in the book than in the show. Like in the show, it's just kind of like this weird tangent. It's a very strange way to. It feels like a strange way to start, but they had to really because that's how they started the book. But I like it better in the book. But he's still in last place. He only has one chapter, but.
I think it's infinitely better in the book. But honestly, I tried to watch Game of Thrones years before I actually did. And I watched just the opening scene and I was like, I'm not really interested in these ice zombies.
Yeah.
And gave up
Ice
for
zombies.
years and years.
Yeah.
Whereas in the books, George is very good at writing horror sequences, and that's really what that is. But there's a lot of symbolism in that chapter too. But I would also put him last. But respect.
But number 8, this is where maybe my most controversial pick. Number 8, I have Daenerys. And maybe we kind of know how I feel about her, but I've always found her adventures in Essos to be among the more dull storylines in the series. They have high points, but for the most part, I think they're pretty dull.
It's tough being disconnected from everyone else.
I particularly don't really care for her storyline with Khal Drogo. I do think the book does a better job of characterizing the other characters around those two, outside of Drogo and Jorah. But it just, I don't know. It makes for a little bit of a dull read when you just want her to hatch dragons and get on with it. So,
which was one of the only things you knew going into the show was that there was.
Yeah, I guess if you didn't know whether there were going to be dragons, then it would be more interesting. But I do know that. So. Number 7, I have Bran. Obviously notorious as the series goes on, and rightly so. But I actually do think his early storyline, where he's still in Winterfell, is pretty solid. And it's through his eyes that we actually start the he's the first point of view character after Will, where we get the beheading of Garrett, and the inciting incident of Cersei and Jaime pushing him out later on. So that's also through his eyes. Things do kind of grind to a halt for him after that, but they do have that really great chapter in the crypt that I like too. So overall, I think he's pretty clear. I like him more than Daenerys.
He's got a lot of heart. Like, I mean, he's a sweet kid, but often his chapters were where I would slow down reading a little bit.
Definitely. 6, I have Jon Snow. So kind of crazy because he's my favorite Game of Thrones character, but 6 in the book, I think his early chapters kind of had the tendency to run a little bit dry just because it's just him training basically, but they do kind of hit their stride as they ramp up toward the end, where he's disappointed by his post, and gets more secure in his friendship with Sam, and gets in trouble with Alistair, All that stuff I think is really strong. Kind of gets more of a bond with Lord Commander Mormon. It's good stuff, but I think there's just stronger characters in this book, or stronger chapters. 5, I have Arya.
Hmm.
Arya is a grower, I would say, in book 1. She kind of goes from like this bored child to a trained killer on the run in the span of one book. It's
Yeah.
only in 5 chapters. She only has 5 chapters in this book.
Wow.
And I think it's a pretty breakneck pace for her, if you think about it that way. Her overhearing of the Varys discussion with Illyrio and the crypt is interesting. But I think maybe most interesting is that it is through her eyes that we kind of witness, if you will, the death of Ned Stark, which is obviously the most consequential and harrowing event in the first book.
One of my things with book Aria, over show Aria, is I think book Aria doesn't look down on traditionally feminine things or people
Hmm.
in the way that show Aria does.
Okay.
Like she doesn't have the girls are stupid attitude that show Aria does. She's not naturally adept at those things and she goes a different way, but she doesn't disrespect
Okay.
women in the same way that show Aria does.
Interesting.
Although show Aria is, of course, Maisie Williams, super endearing. And
Yeah. Number 4, I have Tyrion. So he's Tyrion, so he's always going to be pretty entertaining. A Game of Thrones is definitely not his best book. He certainly takes more of a center stage in the sequel. But I do like his. Well, there's some good stuff in his chapters. I do think that his saga in the Vale is a little bit of a time sink that doesn't really ultimately lead to a whole lot other than the start of the war. But at the end of the day, he is still the wittiest character of the series, and obviously George's dialogue work is at its best with Tyrion, I would say.
you can tell he has a lot of fun with him.
Yeah, so for that reason, he's number 4. Number 3, this if Daenerys is not my hottest take, this is my hottest take. It's number 3. I have Ned.
Mm.
So the main character, I would argue, of the first book and the season, and thus the focal point of this story, and kind of the narrator as we go into the web of lies and conspiracy that is King's Landing. His investigation and his revelations are a lot of fun, and him kind of delving into the psyche that he has as he kind of grapples with his estranged relationship with King Robert, like you talked about. And then considering his next fateful steps in the wake of his demise, all really great stuff. But there were just 2 characters that I liked book-wise more.
And can I just say, I am thrilled. I did not know this list beforehand. And these are 2 of the most disrespected characters that get so much more hate than they deserve. And that chapters truly are a delight.
Yes.
Or heart-wrenching, but
2, I am going with Catelyn.
Okay.
She's definitely
Wow.
expanded significantly in the book compared to the show, which basically removes her relationship building with the rest of her family, like Brendan and then her dying father. Like none of that is in the show. And then also like the flashbacks with like the her childhood with Littlefinger in the book, really great. Not in the show.
They reference it a little bit, but
Not that we get to like really experience though.
Yes.
And then it's also through her that we get all the Rob stuff.
Yeah.
Which is undeniably one of the kind of driving forces late in the book as the North is kind of rallying together to avenge Ned. So for all those reasons, I have even higher than Ned himself. But my number 1, I do have Sansa.
That's amazing.
Only 6 chapters in the first book, but each of them I thought was fascinating to me as a show fan first. Just because as a book fan second, her character is just the most improved by far in the books, and diving into her psyche is thus the most interesting because it was unexpected to me that her character is different in the books, and so every time I was reading one of her chapters, I was like really interested to see what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I think my favorite chapter in the book, which we already discussed, is a Sansa chapter, which is whenever they're grappling with them taking Ned hostage and all that stuff, and getting some insight into what the Lannisters are dealing with or planning. And I think she probably has the best arc of any character in the first book of the point of view characters.
And I think she's a lot of the heart and soul of the series and kind of a moral compass. I mean, she's deeply flawed just like the rest of them, and that's something George is really good at, is creating very real characters
Yes.
that have real flaws. And so I'm not saying she's perfect.
Yes.
But she's absolutely a brilliant character that gets hated on a lot because she talked to Cersei
it's because she's annoying. That's the thing that people don't like when it comes to television is they hate annoying characters, and she is annoying in the show. And I don't understand. This is something that we've talked about in the past. I don't know when the trend started of that we have to make all these annoying characters in television. Now, Game of Thrones does not do that with everybody, and so like they have the characters that they want you to like, and they make them badass as fuck. Thinking about Jon Snow in particular right now, with like all the stuff that we've been watching in season 5, but I do think maybe tend to neglect other characters, or they make kind of fall characters in a way. It's like characters that you're not supposed to like. Whereas I think book wise, it's not so much like that. It's like all the characters are more nuanced, and I don't think he really writes them with you're supposed to like this character, or you're supposed to hate this character like the show does.
Sure. I can think of one prologue exception.
Okay, well,
But
yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, you definitely don't like that character, if it's the same one I'm thinking of.
yeah.
But then. Well, anyway, we're not talking about those later. But yeah, I think this trend of having annoying characters in television is a fault of television that books don't have as much.
I am a little bit defensive of annoying characters, maybe because I was an annoying kid, and so it's like there's so many worse things you can be than annoying.
Yeah, I hear you. But for people that are watching something in their spare time, they want to be entertained. They don't want to deal with these annoying characters. They're entertained by Walter White. Skylar's trying to put a stop to all of his entertaining antics. People don't like that.
Sure, well, and that's what I was going to say about Sansa.
She also sings that horrible song to that guy.
Sansa tips off Cersei, and that ends up getting Ned killed.
Well, I don't even think that's it. I think it's just a personality thing that people don't like. Like if you ask Brandon and Brett, both of whom absolutely hated Sansa in the show, I think it's just because they just think she's petulant and whiny, and it's just a personality thing.
Okay. Well, and I will say later in the show, she is not petulant and whiny, and I like her less.
Yeah, maybe annoying in other ways that we can discuss later. But there we have a very in-depth analysis of Game of Thrones Season 1 and A Game of Thrones, the book. I enjoyed putting it together. I'm looking forward to doing the same with future seasons. We're on Season 5 right now of the show, and to the end of it. And we're on Book 3 for what we're reading through, and that we're doing. That's obviously going a lot slower than watching the show. So we'll at least be able to do something similar with this one for Season 2 and A Clash of Kings, and we'll be able to compare them before we have to change up the format somewhat as we get ahead of where we are in the book. And they are very long, so not anywhere near as bingeable as the show is. But we will obviously continue the Game of Thrones series. Until next time, if you enjoy the show and you want to hear more from us, please subscribe, follow, like, review, wherever you listen to your podcast. And remember, you can write into the show for any reason and have your comments read on the air at controlledburnes with an ES at gmail.com.
Also, if you'd like to send in your Song of Ice and Fire theories, I'm a bit obsessed. I have strong opinions. Just put a spoiler warning for Andrew, and I can read those privately and then comment on them either covertly or as we get that far in the series.
Okay. So until next time, keep it warm.
Keep it warm.